the house.
We don't want to know.
We're dedicated here
to our favorite shows.
Oh, my circuits.
Everybody loves Hypnotoad.
Scary Dog.
Flirson at Blurnsball.
Futurama.
Welcome to Radulich Broadcasting Network's review of episodes 1 through 3 of Daredevil. I'm Gavin, and I'm assuming that Mark Radulich is going to join me and not make me fly solo. Come in, Mark.
I'm here, sir. How you doing?
I'm doing all right. I'm doing a little bit of last-minute research, making sure I didn't miss any tips and trivia and inside information and quirky little Easter eggs hidden inside the first 3 episodes before we get started here. But it seems like I'm more cut up than I thought I would be.
I have to say, Daredevil was not my most favorite character of the Marvel Pantheon. And when I heard they were going to do these series for Netflix and Daredevil was going to be one of them, my reaction was kind of meh. And then I was looking at people's reactions to the series and said, all right, people seem to be making a huge fuss about this, claiming it's great. So let me sit down and start watching it. And as it turns out, my first impressions, and I've only watched the first 3 episodes, but my first impressions of Daredevil were they did a better job of creating a Gotham television show than the actual show Gotham.
Well, that's always been the thing with Daredevil, is that the origin story is somewhat similar to Batman. The character itself is somewhat similar to Batman, at least on a psychological level, which is not to say that Daredevil is a ripoff of Batman, because there are inherent parts of each character that separate them. But that was, for me, the biggest part of dealing with the Ben Affleck version of the Daredevil movie, that it played too closely to the 1988 Tim Burton Batman film, in that you had this very gothic-looking city. Everything was very dark, and we get it, Daredevil's blind. But it was a very gothic, very dark-looking city. You had the repeated imagery of laying a rose at the place where his father had died. You have this mob corruption, a city that is at its very core broken. Then you have the extended fight inside of an elevated location, which sees the main bad guy plummet to his apparent death from the top of a church bell tower and onto the ground below. And so it played a little too closely to Batman for my liking. However, I am a fan of the Daredevil character. I'm a fan of the Daredevil comic books, and especially the last couple years where Mark Waid and Chris Samnee have they've injected a little bit of levity and brightness into the comic book that for many years through guys like Frank Miller and Brian Michael Bendis was incredibly dark. And I don't think that the Mark Waid version that's much lighter would translate as well to the Netflix series as the darker version that we're getting.
When they rebooted the Incredible Hulk comic book and made him an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. and called it the Indestructible Hulk, Bruce Banner had a insurance policy that is, if something happened to him or if he was betrayed, like maybe sent up in a spaceship into deep space to live on a planet or something like that, his partner, his hidden partner, his mystery partner would be contacted, and hopefully he'd be saved or something would happen, and that mystery partner ended up being Daredevil, Matt Murdock, and I liked that aspect of the character, that he was sort of there for guys like Bruce Banner in case S.H.I.E.L.D. screwed him over, and that element of his character, I think, comes out in this series, that this isn't just Jim Gordon fighting the unending fight in a city that's corrupted from the inside out. That he's also he's there to he's fighting for the innocence. He's fighting for the people who are in need of a hero to fight for them. And one of the things I liked about the first 3 episodes was, and I'll tell you this, if I were a kid, if I were, 10, 11, 12, watching the show, I probably would have hated it. But as an adult, I can certainly appreciate this aspect of it. There's a lot more of a focus on him using his powers to identify, the people who are telling the truth and who are innocent of the crimes they're being accused of than there is him being a superhero beating the snot out of people in the street. But I will say there's also there's also an eerie similarity to Batman Year One in this.
Yeah, this is sort of the ground zero of Daredevil. And the thing with the heartbeat that you're talking about, the identifying who's guilty and who's innocent, that becomes a hallmark of the character later on, where he decides he's only going to defend people that are telling the truth, and he uses their heartbeat as a lie detector. And obviously that opens up plot devices such as, well, what if someone can remain calm enough while they're lying that they can beat Daredevil's built-in lie detector? So I think they're doing a good job of alluding to these things without being overt about them, and that's one of the problems that comic book properties present, is it's very hard to be subtle with some things. And I was kind of worried that they would get hammy with some of what Daredevil does, because in the comic books, you'll see Daredevil's view of things represented by almost a topographic radar. And I was really hoping that we wouldn't get something like that on the show, and at least through the first 3 episodes we haven't. I certainly hope it's not coming later on. And we don't get anything like we saw in the Ben Affleck movie, where he sees, what's her face, Jennifer Garner, where he quote-unquote sees her by way of the raindrops bouncing off of her. Instead, they use things like his hearing, his heightened sense of smell, to just sort of, instead of overtly showing you, hey, this is what Daredevil sees and experiences, they just relay it to you in real time as he takes it in and explaining it to other people. And I like the little bits of subtlety that we get, as opposed to beating us over the head with the powers and abilities that he has.
I'm going to jump right into Charlie Cox's performance. One of the things that really sells me on the show is his understated performance. He's not chewing scenery. He's not, jumping out in the middle of the screen going, I'm here to defend the innocent. I mean, that's what he's doing, but he's doing it in a very laid-back way. He, and even his, and even the scenes where he's Daredevil, he isn't all, it isn't, you could believe that a guy who's had martial arts training and has heightened senses is doing the things that he's doing. I haven't been taken out of the show, just in the first 3 episodes at least. I haven't been taken out of the show. I mean, they use the entire second episode to show you that he can get beat up and nearly killed. Yes. And that one of the things that makes him a hero and sets him apart from others is his will to survive and persevere. Even in the face of a beatdown. But getting back to my first point, Charlie Cox is playing the role, in a very laid back, subtle way, and not in a sort of a scene chewing, overly bombastic way. And I think that's why it works.
Yeah, and Charlie Cox, I think, has done a very good job of capturing what the essence of the Matt Murdock character in the comic book is. Because Matt Murdock in the comic book, these Marvel characters that Stan Lee created in the 60s, the common theme with all of them is they're inherently flawed. There's something at the core of them that separates them from the all-powerful characters of the DC universe. And that was the big difference between DC and Marvel for so many years, was with DC, you were essentially getting a modern version of the Greek gods. You were getting Superman. You were getting the Flash, who was the fastest man in the world. You had Wonder Woman, who was the alpha female, the Amazon warrior. You had Green Lantern, who could make anything he wanted with his mind. You had Batman, who could outsmart, outthink, outwit, outfight anyone. And so DC creates these flawless characters, these ideal men and women that can save us from any problem. What Stan Lee created with Spider-Man, with the Hulk, with Daredevil, with the Fantastic Four, were a set of heroes that were intrinsically flawed and that people could relate to. Because Peter Parker, for all of his powers, he lost someone very close to him. He struggled to keep a job, and his main concern was protecting the people that he cared about. Those are all things that your average person on the street can relate to. With the Hulk, it's the idea that Bruce Banner has to keep his emotions in check. He can't let his temper get the best of him. Certainly something that most of us can relate to. And with Daredevil is the guy that feels like he has to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders, and he does so with a false aloofness. He moves through things with this confidence and with this air about him that he's in control of the situation, when in reality, as you pointed out, he's very much human. He can get beat up, he can get killed, he makes mistakes, he makes errors in judgment, he finds himself in situations that I'm sure will come into play later in the series that could have been avoided if he had simply used a little bit better judgment. And so he becomes the self-appointed big brother for the world. And I think that Charlie Cox has done an excellent job of capturing that. And it's not something that's easy to portray for the first 3 episodes of a series. It's something that becomes much easier over a longer arc. But I think that he's done an excellent job. And you said that he doesn't chew the scenery. I agree with that, but he certainly commands the attention of every scene that he's in. And he should, because he's the focal point of the show. But, for example, the scenes where they walk in to meet Karen Page, played by Deborah Ann Wall from True Blood, or when he's going back and forth with what we later learn to be Wilson Fisk's right-hand man, he commands the attention of the scene. He has a very magnetic presence on the show.
Oh, I would absolutely agree with that. He is the star, and his star shines bright on the show. And he's got a very magnetic personality, and his performance is magnetic as well. I wanted to make the point though that he's not Captain America, and that's not a slight against Chris Evans. But right. Chris Evans' portrayal of Captain America, besides being a man out of time, is that he is a symbol of goodness. He's as close to Superman as we're going to get in the Marvel universe without all the power. Right. He is the best of us, and that's not Matt Murdock. Nor is, and I'm going to make this real quick comparison. Nor is he Batman, where certainly he's got some stuff going on with him, obviously, but he isn't nearly as tortured a character as Batman turned out to be as the years went on.
Right.
But he is definitely, and I will say this is not a one-man show. More often than not, I find with a lot of shows, they cast a lead, and everyone sort of revolves around the lead, and the lead is the anchor of the show, and the whole thing sort of lives or dies by their performance and their ability to draw viewers. And that's not the case necessarily with this show. I would tell you that the guy that plays Foggy and I said Karen Page, who's the one that patches him up in the second, Rosario Dawson. He's got a great cast around him, and they're all playing that. Like, I can't complain about anyone's part so far. Even people who play minor roles in this, like in the third episode, the guy that they're defending who does the hit, and then at the end gives up the Kingpin's name and kills himself rather graphically. Spoiler alert.
Yeah.
I haven't seen anybody yet who had broke the fourth wall so badly with their acting. Everyone has kept up their end of a scene, and it makes for an excellent dramatic television. I mean, you've heard me say many times the best show in the history of television is The Wire, and this is not the time or the place to have that argument once again. That's the time and the place would be the Casual Heroes WrestleCast, but one of the reasons why I said that was everybody showed up to play. It wasn't one guy, and a bunch of scrubs or whatever. It was an ensemble where everybody hits their notes in every scene, and that's so far what I've seen out of Daredevil. Is I haven't seen a weak performance out of anyone. And as a matter of fact, it's one of those shows where there have been shows in the past where I wasn't interested in what was going on with any of the other characters other than the lead. Either I didn't like their stories or I just didn't like them. And I haven't had that problem with Daredevil as of yet. When they shift away to Foggy, or when they do a flashback to when he's a kid, or when they're with the villains, I'm still drawn to those characters and what they're doing, and I'm interested for the full hour of the show.
To me, probably the most impressive bit player, and not bit player, but secondary player behind Charlie Cox, has been Vondie Curtis Hall, who plays the African Americanized version of Ben Urich, and normally you would hear me screaming about things like, there's no need for this. It's obviously an appeasement for racial diversity to make sure there's a black character on the show, et cetera, et cetera. I have no issue with this simply because Vondie Curtis Hall has been magnificent as reporter Ben Urich. I have thoroughly enjoyed his portrayal, and he's been in a lot of stuff through the years, but nothing that really jumps out at me or anything that I remember particularly seeing him in. But I've been very impressed with Ben Urich, and he's really drawn me into that arc of the show.
Yeah, he, like I said, I wasn't tremendously familiar with the Daredevil comic book, so the first scene they show him in, I didn't know who he was supposed to be or what the point of it was. But I kind of just opened my mind to it and said, okay, well, let's see what happens here. And if nothing else, I was drawn in by his performance. I enjoyed sort of his point of view on things. And the next time you see him, he's arguing with the editor about a story, and see season 5 of The Wire for more of this sort of thing. It's like, hey, your story doesn't sell papers. This does. Go do this. And his frustration with that. But he himself plays the part so well and with so much fervor and emotion that I was interested in what he was doing and why he was doing it, even if his motivations I've already seen played out in an entire other series.
For anyone that's a fan of the show that may not be a fan of the comic book necessarily or isn't familiar with who Ben Urich is, Ben Urich is an old-school beat reporter that still believes the news should be reported as the news, which, again, Vondie gets across very well. But at the same time, Urich also represents just a throwback to an older generation. He's very resistant to technology. You'll see him carrying around a notepad and scribbling in it instead of typing things in on a phone or a digital recorder. He still sniffs out leads. He still throws out bribes like cheese blintzes to hospital CEOs or presidents to help smooth things over that he needs. He's just very much an old school reporter, and he sort of becomes the voice for Daredevil. He becomes the guy that tells Daredevil's story. So if this plays true to the comic book, we're going to see Daredevil through Ben Urich's point of view several times. And it sort of ties you to where Daredevil is in Hell's Kitchen in New York in the larger universe and the things that are going on. He becomes the sort of Deus Ex Machina to tell us what's happening in other places, because there's no reason to bring up certain other things in the Marvel Universe or in Daredevil's world, but you can have Ben Urich talking about the story he's working on. So I'm interested to see how they put him to use. And again, very impressed with the portrayal so far.
One of the things I've really liked about the show is how it fits into the greater Marvel Cinematic Universe, which it was meant to. All of these shows that were developed by Marvel and Netflix are supposed to fit into that world somehow. And this seems to be, well, at least in the first 3 episodes, it's not stated directly, it's certainly nodded to. This is in the wake of the Chitauri invasion that we witnessed in The Avengers. And they're rebuilding New York, a New York that has been devastated by the invasion. And I like that. I like the fact that things matter. For what anyone thought of The Avengers, and I have been known to say that it was less a movie and more of a roller coaster ride, more of a simulator than anything else. There are stakes. Things matter. That something that happens in a movie like The Winter Soldier has ripple effects that affect Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and affects the next Avengers movie. Obviously, it doesn't affect things like Guardians of the Galaxy because they are not in the same sphere as of yet. But it gives me hope that there's a big there's a big plan and a map at this Marvel Studios where when something happens in a movie it affects these other areas, and Daredevil is right in the middle of that. They're dealing with a New York post-devastation, which opens up opportunities for criminals and no-goodniks to do dastardly things. And they jump right into that with the first episode without having to lean too heavily on either those events or the Avengers themselves. And that's it. That's all you need. You just need to know that, hey, we're living in a world that was fucked up by Loki and the Avengers, and go. And so I like that. I like that connection to it. And I'm anxious to see what more they do with the greater Marvel universe on this show.
Well, episode 1 it's interesting because a lot of times the pilots for shows feel like they have to throw everything at the wall, give everything that they can away, see what sticks, and go from there. And that's a byproduct of the network television landscape. You have to make a splash. You have to get immediate attention. Netflix series don't have to do that because they have a set amount. They're not going to get canceled after the 4th episode if they're not getting ratings. They know that they have a definite 13-episode arc. They have 13 hours to tell their story, and so they can afford to pace things a little bit differently. And we see in episode 1, I believe it's titled Into the Ring, we see the backstory of how Matt Murdock became Daredevil. And I really, really enjoyed the Frank Miller-esque opening of Matt Murdock sitting in the confessional booth. I thought that was very well done, and it definitely veered away from colors, loud noises, and explosions of the Avengers, and it took you into a darker, grittier corner of the Marvel Universe right off the bat.
I also thought the confessional scene was a very stark contrast to the hero figure in and of itself. Many of these heroes that we've seen in the movies, Iron Man, Thor, they're not particularly reluctant heroes. Maybe the only one that's sort of reluctant is the Hulk, and that's because he's an out of control beast. But if everyone else sort of chases their heroism, and sees themselves as being part of a greater good, that's certainly one of the themes going forward with the Avengers and leading into Civil War is what is the role of the hero. Whereas what I got from the confessional scene is somebody who didn't necessarily want to become a quote-unquote superhero, but was rather pushed into this by circumstance. He sees a city that's corrupted, and he feels that something has to be done to give police and lawyers an edge to take the city back. You get the sense very early on that he's taking a drastic measure because he feels like he has no other options. And I like the fact that he asked the priest for forgiveness for what he was about to do, because he knew what he was about to do on some level is wrong. But it has to be done. It serves the greater good. So right there, beyond apart from what we've seen so far in the Marvel Universe.
Well, beyond our introduction to Matt by way of Charlie Cox, we also get our introduction to Frank Foggy Nelson, played by Eldon Henson, and I was very impressed with the chemistry that these two have, because the role of Foggy is not something that's easy to play. In the comic books, Foggy is the levity, and he is what keeps Matt grounded. He is the humor. He is the heart of the book. And that's not an easy role for the comic book, to maintain the levity, the humor, and to be the heart of a guy that's probably going to go very dark places over the next 13 episodes. I thought that their chemistry right off the bat was fantastic. It made things a lot of fun to watch. And Matt's calm and cool demeanor in the legal situations plays perfectly off of this almost frenetic energy that Henson brings to Foggy.
Yeah, I like the interplay between the two of them. I like the fact that Foggy Nelson is not John Larroquette's character from Night Court. He's not a scumbag or anything. He's what anybody wants to be. He wants to do good things, but he also wants to make money. Characters that are shades of gray and more like actual human beings are more interesting to me, and he is eminently human, obviously motivated by money, but not a greedy, villainous, mustache twirling jerk. And I think he's also the guy who, in many scenes, especially in the first episode, is the one reminding Murdoch that you're going to have to bend on certain things in order for us to have any kind of success. That
right.
Whatever idealism you're clinging to is going to have to give way to some realism. And again, I also like the fact that as they introduce the Karen Page character, again, I said he's not like Dan from Night Court. He's not so overly sexual that it gets ridiculous as the episode goes on. He's like any other male. She's a pretty female, and she doesn't appear to be nuts. So why not? Just for the record, I would watch John Larroquette as Daredevil, if anybody's wondering. You would John Larroquette as Matt Murdock, that works for you in casting? Absolutely. John Larroquette as pretty much anything works for me. I'm not saying that it would be good. I'm saying I would watch it. Sure. But yeah, he doesn't. I've seen too many characters written or acted that are just one note. They're there to hit the jokes, and that's not what Foggy is doing. Foggy has a perspective. He has a voice in the show, and sometimes it's backing Murdoch up, and sometimes it's in contrast to Murdoch, so that there's tension in the scene, and it works very well for me. I was very surprised because as soon as I saw his character, I kind of went, "Oh no, not this again!" And I was happily surprised. Yeah, you can't have a Daredevil without a Foggy, and I'm interested in watching that relationship grow. And as far as relationships go, Karen Page is the notorious relationship in the Daredevil book. Throughout the character's history, she's been a thorn in his side. Not as an enemy, not as someone who necessarily betrays him, just as someone that is a constant source of stress and grief for who Daredevil is and who Matt Murdock is. And I'm not going to go into great spoilers because I don't know how long they're going to take to develop that or how they're going to develop that. But Deborah Ann Woll does an excellent job of making Karen Page look both
like a victim and like a very strong character who's willing to fight for herself. The setup with her leaning over a bloodied homicide victim holding the murder weapon and screaming, it certainly paints an interesting picture for this lawyer and his partner, and gives you almost a John Grisham type feel for the whole thing, and especially as they get involved with the henchman for Wilson Fisk. We see Toby Leonard Moore playing Wesley, as he's the guy that pulls the strings for Vincent D'Onofrio's Wilson Fisk. And he, in his own right, I know he's not the big bad on the show, but he in his own right is just a creepy, creepy guy.
The scene where he's coercing the father into doing whatever they need him to do, and and they do so. First of all, nice use of modern technology. What was that? A Microsoft Surface?
Yes.
And so they have, and so they just open it up, and there's a clear view of the daughter at school, and there's a henchman sitting right there within a few feet of her, and he's like, "Give us a wave." It's like, this is the sort of thing that we're doing now in film and in television. We're really using the tablets and internet connectivity and social media as a way of moving the plot forward. It was a fun scene, but yeah, he is slimy, he is menacing, he is everything you want someone to be. I mean, he kind of reminds me of a Leonardo DiCaprio Wolf of Wall Street type, where he's just what a smooth psychopath. And
yes.
and he's not Maleficent or anything. He's just very matter of fact. We have the world by the balls, and you're going to do what we want, or we'll just start killing you and everyone you know. It doesn't get much more simple than that. Yeah,
and he is the perfect mafia flunky. I've greatly enjoyed him. I inadvertently sort of skimmed over Karen Page, played by Deborah Ann Wall. What are your thoughts on her and her performance in the first episode as sort of the helpless victim that Daredevil has to come save?
I thought it was a spot-on performance. I like her better in the second episode when she's dealing with the trauma of the thing. But this first episode, she's sort of thrown into this horrible situation, imminently believable. The cops are not interested in your fairy story. If they see you kneeling over a dead body covered in blood with a knife in your hand, you're going to jail. It doesn't matter what your story is. So I liked all of that. I liked how she slowly came to trust Murdoch and Foggy, and how the situation resolved itself. I thought, good performance. She gets more interesting as the show moves on. But in the beginning, it was just getting that whole plot and that part of the story resolved. So it's funny actually. I didn't know what to expect from Daredevil, and I put it on with my kid in the room who was 4 years old. And about 5 minutes into the show, my wife was like, "All right, and Lily has to go to bed. Good night." Like, yeah, whoops.
Yeah, this is definitely... Now, again, if this were based on the Mark Waid, Chris Samnee version of Daredevil over the last couple of years, which, by the way, Mark, I cannot encourage you strongly enough to check out Mark Waid's run on Daredevil. He's done 2 series. One was entitled Here Comes Daredevil, and it was, I believe, 36 issues long. And then it rebooted as just Daredevil, which I think it's been another 17 or 18 issues. But the first 2 years of his run on the book, it won several Eisner Awards for Best Ongoing Superhero Comic. Just excellent portrayal of the character and a new spin on things. But it would have been perfectly okay for Lily or any other child to watch, because it's a very sanitized version of Daredevil that focuses more on his legal abilities and his ability to track things down using his heightened senses. we're not getting the Mark Waid version. We're getting the Frank Miller version, and it's going to therefore go to very dark places because that's what Frank Miller does. Dark Knight Returns, Sin City, and probably the Daredevil story, Man Without Fear. And so, yeah, it's certainly not child appropriate. All in all, I thought the first episode was a strong introduction to the series, strong introduction to the characters. And if you have even a modicum of interest in the first episode or in the series, I can't imagine that the first episode wouldn't pull you in hook, line, and sinker.
Yes, I thought the first episode did what it needed to do, which was generate enough interest in seeing how the rest of the series plays out.
Well, the second chapter was probably the best of the three, and that's not a knock on episodes 1 or 3, but episode 2, entitled Cut Man, was a home run by every definition of the term. You mentioned Rosario Dawson and how well she played Claire and her involvement as she plays a good Samaritan to a guy in a mask and a costume, and we later find out what her motivations for those are. But we also get some insight into the final days of battling Jack Murdoch, the club-level fighter that happened to be Matt Murdoch's father, and how he met his untimely demise. We also get a complete absence of Matt Murdoch, the lawyer, because he is all Daredevil in this. And I know what I want to talk about most in this episode, but I will let you throw out what you liked and what you thought about this before we get into that incredible fight scene in the hallway.
The part that I focused on, and the part that kind of kept me interested, was their dynamic. This stranger taking in this guy who was beat to shit and fell in and then thrown in a trash heap, and her taking care of him, and him being kind of secretive with what he's doing, and they're revealing little bits of information as the episode goes on, and then there's that whole rooftop bit, and then finally, he goes and rescues the boy, and you're right, you want to talk about art in direction. There are fist fights, and then there's, and then there's awesome directing of a fist fight. And this was definitely a case of the latter. You're right. This one, because of the narrow focus and because they really slowed down things so that you could focus on the characters, the people that are driving this show, I thought it was stellar. And it was an interesting one to do it because, again, as you said, normally that sort of thing they would have stuck with Matt Murdock. In this case, they slowed the camera and the storytelling down so that you could get to know Daredevil. And Daredevil isn't just punching his way through things. Daredevil has a point. Daredevil has a perspective on things. Daredevil has motivation. And it isn't just fight, kick, punch, ninja. Because he's got to sit there and deal with this nurse, and this nurse, over time reveals to him that, he's saving innocent people, and that is enough for her to reach out and help him. I really thought that was great. Thought they took a chance. There could be somebody, who saw this episode and was like, woof, can we get back to, the stuff that we enjoy about this show? Too soon. But I thought that even though they took a chance, they hit it out of the park. And I was very impressed by the performances and by the direction.
Well, very quickly before we start dissecting that fight scene, I thought they did a good job of breaking things up just every now and then by cutting away to Foggy and Karen and their night out on the town as they wondered what had happened to Matt. And I thought it was a touching moment in the bar where Foggy was clearly making up names and backstories for people to put her at ease. It shows the true character and the true heart of Foggy. And the fact that he's willing to do that to help someone that he barely knows, that they have a very brief acquaintance, it gives you an idea of the character that Foggy will be throughout the show. And I enjoyed that they used those scenes to break things up and keep it from becoming too incredibly dark. But really, let's talk about the fight scene.
One second. As a mental health professional, you watch any episode of Law & Order, you have something horrible happen to somebody, a very traumatizing experience, but they focus on the legal part of it, and then the show's over. And then you never see what happens to that person later on. The nice thing about this is that, the first episode could have been a Law & Order episode, with this person being, the victim of a horrible crime. The nice thing is the second episode was the day after. What happens to these people who are put in those circumstances, and how does it affect their mindset? And I love the fact that, she felt like she couldn't go home. And that this wasn't a relentless pursuit of sex so much as it was somebody reaching, trying to reach out a friendly hand and say, it's okay. I'm here for you. We're here for you, and we know that life sucks right now, but, we're going to help you get through this, without actually saying any of that. And so I enjoyed her having to deal with the trauma of it all, and as you said, I enjoyed him creating a situation where she could start to heal. For no other reason than it's the decent thing to do. And I'm sure on some level there's a motivation, but it wasn't necessarily prevalent in that episode.
Right. And I think if you're going to characterize the character of Foggy Nelson with one word, decent is the word to use. He's a decent person. But really, the fight scene. I could go on and on. We could do an entire podcast about this fight scene and the attention to detail in it, and the layers that are in this. Because, first of all, we've pointed out that Daredevil is a hero that gets hit. He is not invincible. He is not indestructible. And he limps into this fight to begin with. He's been patched up. He's almost died choking on his own blood and fluid in his lungs. He has puncture wounds. He's bleeding. He's had a rough day already. So he limps into this fight. And he does so fearlessly because, again, he is the man without fear. And what progresses over the next 3 minutes or so is one of the best American cinema fight scenes that I've ever seen. It's very much an homage to Old Boy, with the fighting in the hallway with one man against a small army of thugs. And we see Daredevil bouncing off of walls and doors and using various non-traditional fighting techniques as he goes against this band of thugs. But what really struck me and what really impressed me with the fight was it's evident that this is a long shot, one take deal. That, obviously there may have been more than one take at this, but whenever they filmed this, however many takes it took, it was filmed in one long shot. This was not fight for 20 seconds, cut, reset. This was a 3-minute fight scene, and the exhaustion starts to come into play the longer it goes on. The punches are not tight, they're sloppy. You start seeing things that are less kung fu technique and more desperation punches and bouncing people off of things. And all in all, I thought this was just an absolutely brilliant scene in the episode.
One of the criticisms that comes up for things like the Phantom Menace is the fights always looked overly choreographed. It's just fight. Everything looks like a ballet. There are no stakes. It's just fighting for fighting's sake, and it gets boring. And it's one of the things that drives me crazy. It's why I don't particularly like kung fu movies. The fight is a thing, and it's either necessary to move the story forward or don't use it in the first place. And what was great about this was there was a story in this fight. From beginning to end. The end being he rescues the boy. Spoiler alert. there is a fight in this story itself. It isn't just guys throwing punches in a very pretty ballet kind of a way. And you're right. Obviously, you have someone who's a trained martial artist, so to not show technique would be stupid. On the other hand, as we know, if you've ever been in a fight, and I have been in plenty, as you get tired, the technique goes away. Guys aren't throwing punches like they're trained to. You got a very realistic impression of what a fight looks like after time has passed, and the guy who's being successful in the fight is exhausted. And you're absolutely right. Between the long shot and the attention to detail in that manner really made it artful. It made it engaging, and I found myself rooting for Daredevil. Besides the fact that he's the hero in the story, and the stakes are there's a kid at the end of this tunnel. I'm rooting for him because clearly, this is Frodo at the gates of Mount Doom. This is this is a man against insurmountable odds who is beat to shit. Trying to get to the end of this test, and it was great. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
There's always something to be said for guys or girls in these heroic situations displaying sheer force of will. And that's what we got here, was a very well shot, long form fight scene where Daredevil / Matt Murdock is putting his sheer force of will on display. And good for him, because I don't know how many takes it took Charlie Cox to get through that, but God bless him however many it took, because it came off beautifully. And I hope that they don't go back to the well on that. I hope that that's something that, occasionally you can revisit it. You can have these type of fights, because Daredevil, throughout his character's history, it ends up, unfortunately, having to deal with evil ninjas and Russian mobsters and things of that nature. But there was a magic in what they pulled off in the second episode, and I certainly hope that they don't ruin it by trying to recreate it over and over.
No. Real quickly, the flashbacks to the father. I just want to say I enjoyed the father's self-sacrifice in the end, because at the end of the day, his son looked up to him, and he needed to show his son he could win. There's a practicality and there's a psychology and emotion to things, and that was a demonstration of, despite maybe common sense, despite logic, despite one's own self-preservation, here was a man who gave into his emotions and just wanted to show his son that he too could be a hero. And he did. And he wins the fight despite it all, and and much to his demise, unfortunately. But it sets off the son in another direction. Who knows if he would have turned out to be Matt Murdock, attorney at law, had he not gone to live with his mother, because the father pretty much went on the run and presumably was killed. So, but I did like that. I did like the fact that the father walked away from being, punchy and a palooka and a guy who throws fights for money, and said, I too can rise above this and be a hero for my son.
Yeah, it's a nice touch, and gives you some idea of the motivation that keeps Daredevil going and why he keeps getting back up, why it's important for him to keep fighting when there's a situation like this young boy that needs to be rescued and returned to his parents. So a nice touch, and again, very well done on episode 2 all around. Certainly the strongest of the 3 so far, at least in my opinion. Looking at episode 3, we open up in a bowling alley, and it would have been nice if this had taken a Big Lebowski turn or even a Kingpin turn, but instead we get another pretty visceral fight between one of Wilson Fisk's men and someone who apparently is on the wrong side of Wilson Fisk. And we see Nelson and Murdoch get their second client after a meeting with Fisk's right-hand man.
I love the intrigue of that. They know he's slime. They know he's connected to the guy who has the New York City by the balls, and yet there's a practicality of taking the case because they need money. And Froggy doesn't know the Daredevil, and so there's that tension as well. And I really thought that there was a lot of balls in the air in this episode, and they managed to keep them afloat fairly well. I was fascinated by the idea of, we know he's the bad guy, but we're going to do this anyway because there's a greater good here. There's a surface greater good of, we need money and they're paying us a lot, and there's the underneath practicality of, at the end of this, maybe we can turn this guy for information, and they do, and unfortunately that results in him killing himself.
Yeah, he went out like a champ.
Yeah, he did.
That's a tough way to go. That's not an easy route. When you decide to headbutt a jagged piece of metal, eye socket first, you're leaving no doubt about it.
Well, it's a television and movies are show me, don't tell me medium. And if you are trying to tell people how fearsome an individual Wilson Fisk really is, headbutting a jagged piece of metal is a great way of showing people this guy ain't no one to fuck with.
Yeah, and we don't see a whole lot of Vincent D'Onofrio in this episode, but what we see of him, that impression comes through very clearly, that he is a man who carries himself with a very quiet, dignified power, but at the same time has made it very clear that he is not afraid to get his hands dirty.
Well, the idea of there's how he maintains his power is through fear, and it is the fear that it's one thing to sacrifice yourself and to make bad choices and all that. It's a whole other thing to put people you love in danger, and that is the crux of his power, is that he uses information to find out where your family is, and he crushes them. Just puts them in harm's way and crushes them, so that the message gets out that if others follow suit, you too will lose your family. And it kind of goes back to the Spider-Man thing of, it's one thing to be Spider-Man and put yourself on the line. It's a whole other thing to have Aunt May and Mary Jane and Gwen Stacy in harm's way when they're not superheroes or had anything to do with the conflict in the first place.
And this was also the debut episode for Vondie Curtis Hall as Ben Urich. And we see what's going on with him as he's negotiating with an insurance company in the hospital, and his editor, and trying to keep Karen Page from doing something that'll get herself killed. I thought he brought a nice energy to the show. I thought he was a nice change of pace as a character, as an actor, a nice change of pace visually, and not just because of his skin tone, because, again, he looks very rumpled, very disheveled, a very throwback look for a reporter. And I won't dwell on this too much, but I really enjoyed Ben Urich in this episode. And again, I enjoyed the subtlety of how Daredevil operates. I'm tracking Wesley's Cartier watch and knowing where he's going and when he's appeared in the courtroom by listening for a distinctive ticking that he is associated with him.
Yeah, that was a nice touch. One of the things the show gets right is attention to details, and that's certainly an example of it. It was definitely an episode that got me interested in where the rest of the series is going, because we finally do get to Wilson Fisk, and otherwise known as the Kingpin. And certainly he was Daredevil's big bad in the comic book. So things are off and running now, and we are out of the first quarter of the book. We are into the second quarter here, where things are going to start to pick up.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward, like you, into getting into the next chunk of episodes here and seeing what develops. I have a feeling I'm going to be very upset when the 13th episode is over and I have to wait on something else to show up. But yeah, I look forward to going through this. It's a character that I enjoy, and it's a character that I have developed a greater affinity for over the last few years. And so I'm very happy that they've gotten this launched, and that they've gotten this launched with a significant backer, a significant partner in Netflix and Disney, and the Marvel Cinematic Universe continues to grow and expand through digital streaming media. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Radulich and Broadcasting Network. Sans one Mark Radulich. My name is Gavin Napier, and I will be your host for the evening. And I do believe, unless Mr. Winfree can correct me on this, I do believe that I'm joined by one Robert Winfree and one Benjamin Clone. How are you, gentlemen?
I'm good, Gavin. Ben is attempting again to call in via Skype. Ben, are you there?
I don't know. Am I there?
You got it working. We're all set to go.
Episodes 4 through 6 tonight. Let's start with Ben. Ben, what did you think of the opening trio of episodes 1 through 3 for this series?
I enjoyed them very much. I'm actually one of those that pretty much set aside the entire day on April 10th and was up till about 2 in the morning watching all of them. And each one was pretty comfortable saying each one was better than the last one.
I know that myself and Mark sort of gushed over episode number 2, particularly the fight scene that served as an ode to Old Boy, with its long shot, one take, attention to detail with one man fighting a small mob. Robert, what in the first 3 episodes stuck out to you?
Well, first of all, it needs to be noted that when you say it references Old Boy, that is the original South Korean film, not the Spike Lee bastardized version. Just for the record, for anyone out there who's curious. The South Korean one is the good one. Spike Lee failed miserably. No, I'm with you about that particular fight sequence. I think you said it was one of the best hand-to-hand combat sequences to come out of American movies or television in the last 5 to 10 years, and I'm hard-pressed to disagree with you there. The other thing that stood out to me and plays more, not in these 3 episodes, but I think the following 3 in particular, I was really impressed with the interactions and the on-screen chemistry between Matt Murdock and Foggy Nelson. The guy who plays Foggy Nelson, coincidentally, Ben might get a laugh out of this. The same guy who portrayed Fulton Reed on the Mighty Ducks franchise. For those of you who are, and I got my brother just about to spit crap out of his nose because he didn't know that. Just random trivia for you there. No, the main cast all has excellent interplay and good chemistry between them. It's an important thing, especially in something like comic book adaptations. You've got to have the on-screen chemistry there, and if you don't, everything else kind of falls apart.
Yeah, and Daredevil being the series that it is, and the source material that it takes from, the chemistry is going to be a big part of everything that happens on the show if it's going to be a successful property, because the dynamic of the comic book is such that if the Matt and Foggy relationship isn't there, then the whole thing sort of comes apart. It's very much the glue that holds everything together. And then spinning away from that, you've got Wilson Fisk, and you've got Karen Page, and you've got Ben Urich, and you've got all of these different characters that get pulled into Matt's world. But it all starts with Matt and with Foggy. And with that, we'll go ahead and jump into episode 4. And what jumped out at me in this episode was both Matt and Karen Page were incredibly reckless in their pursuits in this. We see Matt throwing himself carelessly into danger over Claire, who has certainly pulled him out of the fire once or twice, but we also see Karen trying to do some amateur detective work only to be nudged along by Ben Urich and given some advice. Certainly fans of the comic book will know that there's probably going to be a lot more turmoil in the Matt Murdock and Karen Page relationship. Speaking on the topic of Karen Page and her little amateur attempt at finding out who's behind these attempts on her life at the auction. Robert, how do you feel like Deborah Ann Woll pulled off the character of Karen Page so far?
So far, and I'll go ahead, I don't know if I'm going to be on any of these in the future, I'll go ahead and say I think she does an admirable job throughout the entire series, which should avoid spoiling anything. It's very easy for that character to be written as a kind of prototypical damsel in distress, and it's very lazy to do so as well, mind you, but very easy. And thankfully, both the writing and the acting, when it comes to that character, don't go that route. She's in danger, certainly, but it's more because of her own inexperience. She's actively seeking out, she's proactive instead of reactive. And there's a world of difference as far as just characterization goes. A proactive character is someone who's very, very easy to root for, very easy to get behind, and you're much more forgiving of them, as opposed to a reactive character who sits back and has things happen to them. And she's absolutely proactive, and it's very much to the benefit of everything that particular character is handled in such a way.
Ben, I don't know what your history with Daredevil is. Are you a fan of the comic book, or?
I'm a very big fan of the comic, actually.
Okay, now, when Mark and myself were discussing this last week, I mentioned how Frank Miller's tone that they have adapted this story from was much more suited to what Netflix is doing with this than perhaps the most recent Mark Waid run of Daredevil. Do you think that they've done as good a job as possible as capturing the Frank Miller vibe through the first 6 episodes?
I think not only have they done a good job of capturing the Frank Miller vibe, I think they did a good job of improving on some things that were lacking in Frank Miller's run on the comics. And I've said this before, I've said this earlier this week, Frank Miller has kind of a bad rap when it comes to writing female characters, and it's not entirely undeserved. Karen Page in the show is a little bit more capable and a little less sort of reactionary, I think, as Robert kind of was going into. And she's sort of taking it upon herself to get involved in these things that are happening around her, that she clearly sees that something is wrong, and that's something that was not always there in the incarnations of Karen Page that Frank Miller wrote.
Well, Matt and Karen, while they both certainly played significant parts in episode 4, they were almost a secondary tale to what I felt was the very meat and potatoes of this episode, and that was our real introduction to Wilson Fisk and the man that will eventually be known as the Kingpin. We get a little bit of insight into his character's background. We get some insight into who he was, who he is, who he's going to be. And for much of this episode, it's this dichotomy of Wilson Fisk between being the boogeyman that no one's willing to speak his name, and taking the time to humanize him and showing that he cares about something other than his ruthless criminal empire, and that's this art baroness, Vanessa. Ben, what did you think about D'Onofrio's portrayal of the Kingpin here? Because I've heard mixed reviews of it online. Personally, I enjoy it with the thick, heavy New York accent, and he sort of mumbles his words like Brando, and I've enjoyed it from what I've seen of it so far.
I'm not even sure where the reviews have been mixed. I've seen almost universal praise for Vincent D'Onofrio in the show, at least critically speaking. I'm sure.
Well, I'm not speaking of critics, because, like you said, the critics have just raved over everything about this show for the most part. Speaking of just friends and people on Facebook and seeing just casual reviews of the show, the one thing that I've seen criticized most often has been D'Onofrio's portrayal of Kingpin.
I have no problems with this portrayal at all. This is, I think, when it's all said and done, Vincent D'Onofrio is going to be the thing that is going to be the thing in the character, and that is going to be the most remembered from this first season. And I think it was a very, very smart move that we do not even see him until episode 3, the last minutes of episode 3. Charlie Cox needed those 3 episodes to establish himself as the star of the show, as the protagonist, and to establish his own character, because Vincent D'Onofrio is so magnetic with this role that he's playing, and the character is so easy to just steal scenes and steal entire episodes, that it was very good that this something that the show does very well is build moments, and that moment at the end of episode 3 where you first see Wilson Fisk was built up to over the entire first 3 episodes, and then the events of where episode 4 ultimately ends was also built up to. You're presented with Wilson Fisk as this sort of reserved but kind of a little bit socially awkward, gentleman businessman, and then it builds up to, you're told he's this feared figure in the underworld, but you don't really see that until the very end, and then you understand why he's so feared. He's so feared that people don't even want to say his name out loud.
I think the ending of episode 3, where the thug just realizes, you know what, I've given up his name, it's better that I go ahead and impale my head on this spike than continue in this world. I think that more than anything really established its level of fear with who he is. Robert, do you prefer the portrayal of Wilson Fisk as the boogeyman, the soft-spoken guy that's to be feared, or do you like seeing him get his hands dirty, like at the end of this episode where we see him manage to decapitate someone with a car door?
Well, the beauty of Wilson Fisk, and not just as a character, but in this portrayal, the writing of it, I will say this, I am not a fan of Vincent D'Onofrio in general, at all, but he is just fantastic as Wilson Fisk here. But one of the great things about the character is the stark dichotomy between, you have him when he's trying to be social, when he's talking with Vanessa and asking her out and being on a date, and he is incredibly socially awkward. And rather than being stupid, it's actually, almost endearing, because you've not yet actually seen what Fisk is capable of. Then you see him interacting with the other parts of his criminal empire, and he's a very calm, very assured authority figure. And then at the very end, you see him snap, and he's one of the most legitimately terrifying things that is in this entire series. Occurs when at the end of episode 3, when he drags the Russian mobster out of that car and proceeds to beat him to death. I need to bring this up because otherwise I might forget about it. But there's a real kind of subtle illusion with what they're going for with Fisk that occurs in episode 3 and also in episode 4. For the sequences where he is in the art gallery talking with Vanessa, as well as on their first date, the musical choice in the background is actually the aria from Bach's Goldberg Variations. Now, that may not mean a whole lot to most people out there, and I only know it because I'm so steeped in the mythology of the character that it references, but that is the piece of music that is playing over Hannibal Lecter's escape from prison in The Silence of the Lambs.
Oh, yes.
And this is a very subtle thing, and I'm assuming it's deliberate on their part, that again, maybe you just get a bit of an association with Hannibal and now Kingpin, in that, again, you've got the great thing about Hannibal, whatever version apart from the one from Hannibal Rising, which we do not speak of, is just kind of his dichotomy. He can appear very cultured, very normal, very polite, and then the next minute he's tearing your face off with his teeth. So they've set themselves a very good, and in many ways a very accurate kind of comparative standard right off the bat, and it's a really brilliant and subtle choice to help introduce Wilson Fisk as a character.
I would like to submit that I want to see the phrase "put him in a car" become slang for "that guy's a dead man." in the same. And I want that to become a meme in the same way that Hail Hydra became a meme after Captain America: The Winter Soldier. Just saying.
Internet, you have been given your task.
For me, again, this episode's all about the villains, and not just Wilson Fisk. We see Madame Gao, we see the Russians, and obviously these are going to play into different parts of the Marvel Cinematic Universe or the Marvel Netflix universe as it is. Well, I think it's interesting that through the first 4 episodes, and especially as we go on through episode 6 and tonight's show, certainly the opportunity to discuss some more of these, but we've already seen a handful of potential rogues for Daredevil. We've had the allusion to Crusher Creel already, who will go on in Marvel mythology to become the Absorbing Man, which not a guarantee that we'll necessarily see that on this show. However, Crusher Creel does go on to become the Absorbing Man at some point. Again,
Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.
Madame Gao, we've referenced her, and there's some speculation about who could arguably be referred to as the Daredevil villain, the Joker to Daredevil's Batman, at the end of episode 6, and I won't spoil that. I'll wait until we get into that episode. But before we move on to episode 5, anything else you guys want to mention about episode 4? That I may not have glossed over?
The only thing I want to mention is that they continue referencing some of the events in the greater Marvel Cinematic Universe, which I appreciate. Specifically in episode 3, the line that Wesley bothered me for a while, and it took me a minute to figure out why. But I know a guy who looks almost exactly like that actor, and it was disconcerting. But no, there's a scene when Wesley is talking with the Russians about, how is this guy so, can keep kicking your asses? It's not like he's got an iron suit or a magic hammer. And little allusions to the greater MCU. Oh, one other thing. That whole scene in the taxi garage when when Matt Murdock rescues Claire, I imagine that's what it's like to be on the wrong side of any of the Batman Arkham series games that happen to be stealth missions. This
is as effective an introduction to a main villain of this kind as I've ever seen on a episodic TV. I think it hit every note perfectly. It built up to one of the many money moments in this series. If the single shot fight sequence in episode 2 defined what Daredevil was all about, in the costume as just this unstoppable force of nature that will not give up and will just keep fighting to the point of exhaustion. This did the same thing for Wilson Fisk. This established him as a character. It established him as a physical presence. It told you everything that you need to know going forward from this point on, exactly what he's about in every way that he is involved in the series.
Well, moving into episode 5, Wesley was mentioned, and I want to focus on this as we go through episode 5 because there's a lot going on with Wilson Fisk and with Wesley. They're very much the other side of the coin to Matt and Foggy. And as much as the chemistry between Matt and Foggy on this show is tremendous and jumps out in a very positive way, I think that Wilson Fisk and his right-hand man Wesley, I think they have an equal amount of chemistry, and I think they play very well off of each other. Robert, you mentioned that you know someone that looks very much like the actor that plays Wesley. I see him as almost an evil Josh Charles from The Good Wife and Sports Night. I really enjoy those moments when Wesley is on screen and the chemistry that he has shown with Vince D'Onofrio's Wilson Fisk.
I am very much a fan of the way those two interact with each other because, and Fisk himself mentions this, that Wesley is his friend, which is, again, a very important distinction between everyone else in his life, apparently, that Wesley is someone who actually matters to him. Everyone else is, they're tools, they're associates, acquaintances. They're not actually friends. And he is friends with Wesley, and I think it's I can say this without spoiling anything. I think a big misstep in many ways in season 1 is we don't get a lot of the backstory between Fisk and Wesley, which I feel could have been very, very interesting. And again, I can say that without spoiling anything, that it's just an aspect of their relationship and that is not expounded on to my satisfaction, at least. Which is sad because, like you said, on screen they play off each other very well. There's a lot of fun interactions between them, but that's also extraordinarily serious. I mean, to the point where watching Wesley not react at all to Fisk's just like brutal car door decapitation of the Russian Anatoly it's telling in so many ways that he doesn't react to it, that this has clearly happened before and will happen again. I mean, these are two people who have been together for a long time, and it's sad that in this season, we do not get more of that.
Ben, what's your take on the Wilson and Wesley relationship here, beyond what Robert said? Because being a fan of the Daredevil comic, I know oftentimes we see Wilson Fisk acting as the Kingpin, just sort of barking orders at underlings, and very often in the comic books there's no real strong secondary helper for him. There's no right-hand man for him in the comic beyond just sort of prototypical goons. Does Wesley add to the Kingpin for you? Is this a development on here that you have enjoyed with the series?
I'll take this opportunity to say, me personally, in my opinion, I don't think there are any two major characters in this entire series that interact with each other on a regular basis that don't have good chemistry, which is a really important thing, and it adds a lot to the show in general, because then you actually enjoy seeing characters interact with each other, and that's not always the case. In this instance, I actually really like what you said before, that it's sort of a mirror between Wesley and Wilson Fisk. It's a mirror to what the dynamic is between Matt and Foggy. That's pretty good. If to make a broad and probably comical distinction, but it might make Robert laugh, that he's Waylon Smithers to Fisk's Charles Montgomery Burns. He's
yes, sir.
He's the one that sort of makes everything happen. Fisk is the brains, but only to a certain point. Wesley is kind of the man behind the man, and that's really important. I'm actually trying. It's funny because I actually have Daredevil Born Again in my hand right now, and I'm trying to flip, because I don't remember if this is the comic book story that introduced Wesley as a character, and he's not a big part in the story, but there's one line that I'll probably come back to when I find it, that where it's something along the lines of where all of Wilson Fisk is in a meeting with all of his underlings and all of his underbosses, and he dismisses all of them, and they all leave as per his orders, and the narration goes something like, everybody, all of Fisk's underlings leave to do his work except for Wesley. Wesley always stays behind as the last man to hear any last orders that Wilson Fisk may give, and that's why everybody's always so nice to Wesley.
I need to curse you real quick for something, Ben, because you brought up the Smithers comparison, and now I can't get out of my mind the image of Wesley turning on his computer, and you get Wilson Fisk doing the bit that Smithers has with his computer turning on.
You're welcome.
For those of you who don't know, There's a Simpsons episode where Smithers turns on his computer, and we all know Smithers is gay and in love with Mr. Burns, but in this particular episode, he turns on his computer, and you get a very chopped together, synthesized version of Mr. Burns saying over the speakers of this computer, "Smithers, you're so good at turning me on." And now I can't unhear Vincent D'Onofrio saying that in the Kingpin voice, so thank you for that.
He'd totally do it. You know he would.
He would, too.
In watching how these characters interact with the rest of the cast and not just with each other, Wesley carries his own bit of menace as well. Like he has a very foreboding presence, and I think it speaks to the director and how the show has been plotted, because Wesley himself doesn't do a tremendous amount of really anything on screen to portray menace. He doesn't have mannerisms to speak of. He has a very flat affect. He has this very cold tone, and it's a very matter-of-fact, business-like approach, but he carries his own bit of menace as you see him appear on screen, which I think is what makes him such a nice parallel to Foggy, because Foggy is always upbeat. He's cheering people up. He's trying to help people. And we see that in this episode. We see a bit of Foggy's backbone come into play, which we haven't seen through the first 4 episodes, as they go to the firm where Foggy and Matt interned, and he runs into his ex, who is now a partner, and he stands up to her, and we see a bit of Foggy's backbone, which gives us a little bit more depth to Franklin Foggy Nelson. And we see something that I've noticed. Many of the scenes, not all, but many of the scenes with Foggy tend to be very brightly lit in the show, as opposed to the dark shadows and the undertones of things with Matt, with Wilson Fisk. Foggy, I think, has done an excellent job, and I'm very taken aback by the chemistry that we see between Foggy and Karen in a romantic sense. I did not anticipate a budding Foggy and Karen relationship. Then, for people that aren't familiar with the history of Matt and Foggy and Karen, give us a little bit of background from the comic standpoint versus what we're getting on the show.
In the comics, and I haven't read the original stuff extensively, but I know there was kind of a friendly love triangle between them from time to time, on again, off again, between the three of them. That's hinted in here. Also, this would be a good time as any to recommend anybody who's interested in Daredevil Yellow by Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale. There's a little bit of it in that as well. It's interesting because in the comics it was never so it never got vicious to the point where it really compromised anybody. It compromised the friendship between Matt and Foggy, or either of their relationship with Karen. It was always the friendship won out, but there was still, there's, I guess you could call it sexual tension between these characters. That's played subtle, and I think it's a good idea. It's not something that I think the show would have benefited from jumping right into. There's time enough for that if they want to explore it a little bit more. I think the way they hinted at things here and there worked pretty well. Karen's pretty clearly interested in Matt, at least in a curious sort of way, if not a romantic sort of way. And Foggy's clearly interested in a somewhat more romantic way in Karen, and that shows through. And once again, no two major characters really have bad chemistry in this show, and you extend that to the 3 main characters, and no 3 main characters. Those 3 main characters have great chemistry playing off of all three of each other.
Robert, while we see Foggy and Karen sort of gravitating towards each other in an absence of Matt Murdock, we see Matt Murdock playing up the stereotypical, almost cliche at this point, vigilante character, in that the females in his life are always drawn to them, but no, we must not do this because it would put you in harm's way. We see Matt and Claire gravitate towards each other very briefly, and then they both sort of push away because they realize what the relationship is. Matt realizing that he's placing her in danger, and Claire realizing that this may not be a healthy relationship after all.
Well, I appreciate
Matt
that.
Murdock.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
First of all, I hadn't picked up on the lighting stuff with Foggy the same way that you had, and that actually is a stark contrast to one of my favorite episodes of the entire season. That comes along later. We won't be discussing it here, but it's. I'll go ahead and tell you what the episode is. Murdoch v. Nelson. One of my favorites of the whole season, hands down. And the lighting changes a great deal on that, and I hadn't paid attention enough to notice that one. But so thank you for picking that up on me. I agree about the cliched trope as far as the vigilante can never possibly find actual lasting love and happiness, and it's a bit, again, it's a horrible cliche. At the same time, it's handled a little bit differently here. The issue with Claire is more that she already knows Matt is Daredevil, and the Russians are aware of her existence, and that puts a whole different spin on things from Matt potentially having a relationship as himself. And I don't know if they'll be able to explore that at all. I mean, obviously to one degree or another they're going to, but it's more that, and the impression I got from this was it was more the angle that they came at, Claire and Matt were kind of doomed from the start because she knew who he was, as opposed to someone like Karen who, is not aware of Matt's dual identity. And again, a nice little quick shot at Batman this time around when Claire asks if he's one of those billionaire playboys that wears masks and fights crime at night. Nice.
the subtle digs in this show, not just at DC and other comic books, but on Wilson and Vanessa's second date, we hear mention of a prince in a white suit wearing an ascot, and Fisk says that's a bit much, isn't it? And they're not above taking digs at themselves, which I think is nice. If you're going to take digs at the other guys, you got to be able to take some digs at yourself. We get one of the great contrasts between Marvel and DC is DC's characters, both heroes and villains, are larger than life. They are extremes. They are complete in their essence of what they are. Superman is incorruptibly good. He is unbelievably powerful. He always does the right thing. He always saves the day. The flip side of that is that every villain he has that means anything is completely evil, with no humanizing characteristics. Lex Luthor just hates Superman, and he wants to destroy him, and he wants to take over the world, and he's a ruthless, greedy, miserable person. Brainiac just wants to categorize all life and wipe out anything that isn't him. So it's this very extreme versions of good and evil. Same with Batman and Joker. Same with Hal Jordan and Sinestro and Green Lantern, and we see this over and over. In Marvel, we get more humanized characters. The heroes have flaws, and the villains have motivations that make you empathize with them on some level, and I think that's why I prefer DC's heroes, because they are the epitome of all that is good and what a hero should be, but I prefer Marvel's villains because you can empathize with them. And we see Wilson Fisk explaining to Vanessa what his motivations are and why he feels like he has to get his hands dirty, because money and influence isn't always enough. And he wants to rebuild Hell's Kitchen. Then, in talking about rebuilding Hell's Kitchen and fixing it, how sincere do you think Wilson Fisk is in that, or do you think that he's just placating Vanessa?
I think he's sincere. I at the very least think that D'Onofrio is playing him as sincere. I think and we the three of us, we know wrestling well enough to get this reference. It's the best kind of heel in wrestling, that he believes exactly what his motivations or what he says his motivations are, even if they're obviously not right, even if they're obviously, make him a terrible person. That's a great thing, and that follows from the comic. Wilson Fisk, even in the comics, has always been that guy who thinks, he knows what's best, and he's entitled to what he's striving for and what he's trying to do. I think I think up to a certain point he believes that he's doing the right thing, and by any means necessary. And we see this point in the character's existence where he still thinks he's the good guy, or he still believes that he's the good guy, even though what he's doing is obviously, he's doing some terrible things and he's in league with some terrible people.
Robert, do you prefer your villains to be humanized and explained in a way that we can empathize with them, the way they've done with Fisk in this series? Or do you prefer the big bads that are just over the top and pure evil?
Well, I'm glad you asked me, because, everyone knows I'm all about villains. I prefer my villains to be three-dimensional characters. Now, whether that means they are three-dimensionally evil, like the Joker, for example, who, when he's properly, portrayed, whatever the medium, is not a flat character. He is a three-dimensional character. He's just completely evil. In this case, Fisk is a completely three-dimensional character, more so later in the series when we get some of his backstory, which is equal parts fascinating and horrifying. I just prefer my villains to be well-written, is all, and that the fact that we can understand where Fisk is coming from is a bonus. It doesn't in any way diminish him as a villain. It just makes him... It's understandable, I'm trying to think of an appropriate comparison here, and I'm struggling a little bit. I suppose I could go with, for fans of horror movies out there, when Jigsaw reveals his motivation in Saw 2. It makes him, you understand Tobin Bell as John Kramer, but it doesn't diminish his status as terrifying and murderous and all of these other things. And the fact that we tend to get more empathetic in many ways villains that are three-dimensional characters, I think just speaks to how lazy some writers are, because they don't write, again, a character like Sinestro or the Joker, who is a three-dimensional character. There's just nothing empathetic or redeeming about them, but they're a fully realized character. It's just easier to try and make them, more human and diminish them as villains than to either effectively write them as humans without diminishing them, or write a fleshed out, write a fleshed out character that is, again, fairly static in the sense of they exist within one alignment. And thankfully, we have the perfect blending of Fisk being a villain who you want to see fail, and being a character that you can see his point of view, even if you completely disagree with it, and kind of hope Daredevil bashes his face in.
Yeah, I think that as we head into the next episode, the final episode that we'll talk about tonight, in episode 6, you mentioned, you want to see Matt bash Fisk's face, and we see the first real interaction between he and Fisk, albeit over a walkie-talkie in the bottom of a warehouse. And for all of the chemistry that we have in this show, we see Matt and Foggy, we see Wesley and Fisk, we see Ben Urich, who I think we've not given enough due to, and we'll definitely talk about him in the overall plot of the show, because I think he's been fantastic. And Karen and Rosario Dawson on the show, and even Leland Owsley, who, if you're like me and you saw Leland Owsley on there the first couple of times and you couldn't quite place where you knew him from, that is the outstanding character actor Bob Gunton, who is best known as the evil warden from The Shawshank Redemption. It took me a couple episodes to place him, and once I did, it clicked, and I was like, oh, okay, still a bad guy, always a bad guy. But we
I think his next most famous role would be as the police chief in Demolition Man, wouldn't it?
And again, I regardless of the quality of the movie, I enjoy seeing him no matter what he's doing. But we get the dynamic that so many great hero and villain combinations have had on screen. Whether it's Christopher Reeves and Gene Hackman, whether it's Michael Keaton and Jack Nicholson, whether it's Christian Bale and Heath Ledger, whether it's the complete absence of chemistry between Ben Affleck and Colin Farrell. I think that we see the beginning of something very good between Matt Murdock and Wilson Fisk on this series, and I'm excited to see it eventually come to blows. And we really have no other option for it to come to blows. But to me, this felt, and I understand that I'm stepping on hallowed ground here, this episode to me felt like it was taking a page out of the Breaking Bad playbook, in that it just kept backing our main character deeper and deeper and deeper into a corner, leaving him a very improbable exit to fight another day. Just a general reference to the pacing and to the general tone of this episode. Ben, what are your thoughts on it?
If this were a show that was on network TV, or cable, anything that has seasons where the episodes would come every week, episode 6 would be the mid-season finale. Episode 6 built to a couple of very significant things, and like you said, it builds the stakes with what Matt is faced with. He's got to deal with this, with this Russian mobster that he clearly is disgusted by. He wants to, he probably does want to kill him. He won't do it, but he kind of wants to. It builds, that sort of tension. The cops are closing in. Actually, this episode reminded me a lot of another Frank Miller written comic, which is issue 3 of Batman Year One, that has a similar situation where Batman is trapped in a warehouse and a corrupt, SWAT team is closing in on him, and he's got to kind of fight his way out with I think he had been shot in the leg and the arm. He's trying to fight his way out with one leg and one arm and only a handful of weapons. This seemed pretty similar to that. It seemed like a little bit of a callback to that, and the tension with that is built. And then we get the first interaction of any kind in the series between Matt and Wilson Fisk, and it's just by radio. And they don't, it's basically a Kirk and Khan moment where they're not in the same place with each other, but they're communicating, and the chemistry is still there. It's still, it's still captivating. Like, these two playing off each other, and they're nowhere near each other. That whole sequence, and then Fisk just lets all hell loose. And cops start dying, and they basically Matt has to fight his way out into the sewers to escape. It's if this were a network show and that was the mid-season finale, that would have been a game changer right there, and it would have had you on the edge of your seat for what was coming next.
Robert, in watching this episode, did at some point, because to me, there were just a couple of moments where I thought, overall, very good episode. I've enjoyed everything in the series, but in episode 6, to me, there were a couple of moments where it felt like they were pushing things just a little bit too far. That it was becoming a little bit comic bookish, in that they were going above and beyond the realm of believability that they had established through the first 5 episodes. Did you feel like this episode maybe lost its way for just a moment or two at a couple of points?
Well, my big gripe with this episode is really the amount of corruption they display within the police precinct that responds to... I mean, look, I get that there are corrupt cops. I get that. And I get that we're dealing with a corrupt subsection of New York City within this fictional world, and Fisk has, nearly unlimited resources, so on and so forth. I understand that. You have, the dirty detectives, which I'm okay with. It bothered me a little bit that those 2 detectives could lead a group of other officers that one would assume is at least 10 to 15 strong. You're investigating the site of an explosion. And one of them can very casually shout out to everyone else, if you see anyone alive, shoot them in the head, and no one has a problem. That, again, you have met all of 2 honest police officers in the entirety of this season this far, and I believe through the rest of it. And one of them in this episode is stabbed by a SWAT officer in the neck. That one, it strained my believability because, and part of this is due to the fact that we're dealing with a subset of a larger group. Hell's Kitchen does not have the Hell's Kitchen PD. They're part of the New York Police Department, which is answerable to a whole other string of, in chain of command. And I can't get my head around everyone. I mean, even in Gotham, where theoretically everyone is corrupt, you have enough honest, good, intelligent people trying to do the right thing to counterbalance and make it believable. In this, it seems like that entire precinct is on the take, except the desk sergeant and the guy who's been on the job for 2 months, and again, subsequently is nearly decapitated. And that one bothered me. I get what you're saying about becoming a bit too comic-y. Elements of the final sequence in particular, they fall through a warehouse floor, which is a substantial fall. This is not, somebody falling through and getting right back up. This clearly impacts these people. And then the final sequence in the access tunnels, I see a bit of that. It's one thing for Matt to single-handedly take down a couple of detectives with handguns, taking down trained SWAT officers with fully automatic AR-15s. I'm scratching my head just a little bit at that one.
Well, no, I see where you're coming from with as far as the whole corruption, the police corruption thing. Here's the thing about that, and I've read true crime books, and I know a little bit about that sort of thing, and I've read accounts from people who have actually been in the NYPD and things like that. And here's the thing: when you have a system that is largely corrupt, it's not necessarily fully corrupt, but the problem is it's so entrenched and it reaches the highest levels, at such a high level that you'll have your cops that are not necessarily dirty, but they'll go along to get along. Even the clean cops won't rat on the dirty ones, because then they're going to get, there'll be consequences for that. I'm not saying that's a 100% justification for how things play out in this episode, but it's something that's kind of in the back of my mind when it comes to that sort of thing. Even to, once again, going back to another Frank Miller influenced bit of work in Batman Begins, where where Gordon towards the beginning of that movie, where he's partnered with Flash, who is very corrupt, and Flash takes the bribe, but Gordon won't, and he tells him they see you
not
don't
taking a taste makes the rest of us a little bit nervous, and his response is, "I'm no rat." But besides, in a town this bent, who's there to rat to anyway?
I looked at it along those lines. Even the cops that are not 100%, in Fisk's pocket would never go against the ones that clearly are, because then they're the target. Like I said, that's one way of looking at it. That's just something that had crossed my mind at the time, and that's kind of how I rationalized it.
This episode, we see, I think the other thing, when we talk about it getting too comic-y, To this point, we've had very subtle allusions to what Matt is able to do with his additional senses or his heightened senses. You know, he'll tell Claire, "Hey, there's somebody going door to door in the apartment building. He's wearing just a ton of terrible cologne." Okay, we get it. We've not been over it. We've gotten a glimpse of the way Matt, quote unquote, sees things. What really did it for me in this one was when she asks him if there's anything in the room he can use, and he just stops. And he starts listing pretty much everything that's in the room without moving, without turning, without anything at all. And I thought, okay, we may be going a little too far here, guys. I didn't mind the voice-guided field surgery, but the being able to echolocate everything in the room without moving was a bit of a stretch for me. How far can they push Matt's powers, Ben, without, or his abilities? I don't even know if you want to call them powers. How far can they push his abilities without crossing the line into being hokey?
I think they did a fine job. Actually, for the most part in this series, a lot of his enhanced sort of senses, I think they underplay a lot. Especially, you know, we see the POV of like the radar sense, which was a big thing in the movie, and it's a big thing in the comics. We see that exactly once, and it's in episode 5. You know, as you know, I'm a comic book guy, and I have no big issues with when things get more into the comic book realm and things get a little bit more fantastical. Even a show, even a series that's clearly much more grounded in reality like this one, I like seeing, you know, things kind of push against that. What I know about the comic book stuff, I know that the radar sense that Murdoch has, it works. It actually does work a full 360 degrees around his body. Whether or not that was an allusion to that, whether or not that was something that they implemented, you know, in that scene without actually having to say it and explain it, I don't know. I'd like to think that, because, you know, the writers and the showrunners are pretty on the ball with everything else related to Daredevil. They you know, for all their, you know, for all their keeping everything grounded in the type of reality that they've established, they do a really good job of keeping true to a lot of the core elements of the comic, even the more fantastical ones. So I didn't necessarily find it hokey. I didn't necessarily have a problem with how far they pushed it in that instance. It's just and in the previous episode he went a long way towards explaining that he basically tends to use a lot of his senses all at the same time to compensate for his lack of eyesight, which is kind of gives you plot leeway to explain why he's able to do some of the things that he does. But given what we know about what he's able to do, it also makes sense that he'll do those sorts of things, and he'll be able to do those sorts of things.
Robert, there at the end of the episode, that bullseye?
I don't think it was. I think that was just a SWAT sniper on payroll. Bullseye would not have missed. And I can say this, the detective that he shot, the white guy of the two corrupt detectives, he is not dead at the end of that episode. I don't want to say one way or the other what happens further down the line, but at the end of this episode, he is still very much alive, and Bullseye would not have missed. Okay,
I think that's fair. I personally didn't catch it, but in reading some reviews and making sure that I understood, you know, exactly what we would be talking about tonight, someone mentioned that the sniper had an ace of spades on him. Did either of you catch that?
I was not looking for that, but I might have to double check that.
I caught it the second.
Okay. Yep. Then it might be. You know, again, my reasoning is Bullseye doesn't miss, but by the same token, you can say he did, in fact, hit the target. So I don't know. That was my perspective, but if it is, more power to him. Bullseye's a fun character, and he would be very interesting in, especially in this kind of grounded in reality series, instead of, much as I had some fun with Colin Farrell in the Daredevil movie, drinking and throwing a bunch of bullseyes with darts and then killing someone with a series of paper clips thrown into his throat. I think Bullseye in the real world, for want of a better phrase, certainly a more realistic world, is a very interesting character if they can do him right, and I have nothing but confidence in the showrunners for this show.
Yeah, and again, if I agree with you, if that was there, or if that was Bullseye, then more power to him. It's certainly a nice way to introduce the character and give him a bit of a backstory rather than simply being a maniacal assassin. If it's someone that starts out in the employ of Wilson Fisk and then turns into his own thug and with his own motives to take down Daredevil, then fantastic. And if not, then, congrats to the sniper guy for getting an extra paycheck for shooting dirty cops. Looking at the first 6 episodes as a whole, Ben, you mentioned that this would have been the mid-season break if this were a traditional television show. How does this stack up for you against other offerings from Netflix and how the show has been paced versus something like, say, House of Cards?
I haven't seen House of Cards, unfortunately. It's on the long list of things I need to catch up on. As the first 6 episodes, I think you have a good base and a good starting point, and you basically get the audience going, and you get people excited to see what happens next. If this were, let's say, if Netflix just released the first 6 episodes and told you, we're going to give you these first 6 episodes all at the same time, and then we're going to give you the next, the final 7, 6 months from now, or whatever, 3, 4, 5, 6 months from now, whatever the case may be, hypothetically, you would have, I think you'd have people, chomping at the bit to, we got to know what happens next. The position that Fisk leaves Daredevil in at the end of this episode is he's public enemy number 1. He's on the run. He's been framed for possibly the murders of several police officers, or what we thought was the murders of several police officers. He's manipulated the media. He's manipulated the police. He's manipulated everything, in his favor. And now Matt is truly like the underdog, and he's on the run, and his back's against the wall. And audiences, we tend to like seeing our heroes fight back from these kind of insurmountable odds. So I think it did a good job of, first of all, establishing all the characters, telling you everything you needed to know about them and what they are and what they're doing and what their motivations are, and then start moving the chess pieces around and giving you a taste of the end game and where it's going, but not so much that you don't want to see what's going to happen next.
I do want to talk about Ben Urich and what he brings to this show. I think that his character very much serves as a link to the common man, as one of us watching all of this unfold around him and trying to make sense of it all. Ben Urich's character is someone who plays key parts in the Marvel Universe almost unintentionally. And he's a very troubled character. He beats himself up. He's a workaholic. What's your opinion of the portrayal of Ben Urich so far on Daredevil?
It's kind of funny how he's played in the show versus how he's been played at times in the comic. In the comic, in the Marvel Universe, he's actually an employee at the Daily Bugle, and he pops up in Spider-Man from time to time. And it's always funny, watching him interact with like J. Jonah Jameson and that sort of thing. In the show, I mention this because in the show he kind of serves the purpose. He's kind of the almost like the moral compass for everybody else. Matt Murdock, he means well, and he he tries to do the right thing and he intends to do the right thing. For the most part, he does do the right thing, but at the end of the day, he's a guy who, when he's not being a lawyer, he's dressing up in a costume and beating the hell out of criminals. Ben Urich fills the role of, the guy that's kind of the observer. He sees everything that's going on, and he sort of keeps in line the people who, by being an investigative reporter and exposing the truth, he keeps in line the people who can be kept in line, and the people who can't, who are too corrupt, who are too far gone, who are too powerful and too, thinking they're too untouchable to be kept in line. He's the one that is the threat of exposure and exposing them for what they really are, and by that way is the only way they can be brought down. So it's a really important role, and I say that because in Spider-Man that was actually it's funny because Robbie Robertson kind of filled that role in Spider-Man with Ben Urich kind of being a maverick journalist in that. In Daredevil, and to a lesser extent in the comics, but very much in the show, he fills that role. He's everybody's conscience and he's everybody's moral compass, and he it's a great portrayal. It's a great character to have. For all of these morally ambiguous characters that are running around doing their own thing and feeling fully justified in what they're doing, to have somebody say, well, maybe this is not as maybe you shouldn't be as sure of yourself that you're doing the right thing as you think you are.
I think what I like so much about Ben Urich is he's a good guy, but he's also a realist in many ways, and that is something that in shows like this, you need someone as the anchor, whoever it happens to be. With Iron Man, you had kind of Happy Hogan for a few scenes, or James Rhodey, as kind of an anchor. Just let's pull it back a little bit here. Let's look at things from a different perspective. And everyone has one, which is great about all of these whatever the property is. There's always someone to kind of be the voice of reason in many ways, because especially Karen Page is, borderline obsessed with trying to bring down Fisk, and not that I blame her, mind you, but she constantly goes to Ben with, information that she has, or trying to get him to write things, and he's constantly having to say, maybe it makes sense, but I can't write this because I'll be sued. There are standards, there are sources. I have to be able to defend this in court if necessary, and you're bringing me nothing of that nature. You have things that make sense to you, but I can't write from a completely biased perspective, or people won't buy this. And that's actually kind of counterpointed in a lot of ways with this. We already talked about it, but the conversation between Matt and Fisk over the radio, which is just a brilliant bit of writing, directing, the way it's all put together, really well done. But Fisk says I'm going to blame you for everything that's gone wrong tonight with this whole neighborhood, and people will buy. And Matt's response is, do you really think people are going to buy that? Fisk says, yes. Look at you. You're wearing a mask. You assault people with your bare hands. I've got you on tape assaulting police officers. Now they're going to blame you for everything. No one's going to take your place once you fall. The city's going to burn you in effigy. Your name is going to be mud. And you can kind of slowly see that realization come over Matt, as in the position he's in right now is the worst possible one, and it actually plays into the next few episodes. The conflict about whether or not the man in the mask is a good, what side of the fence is he on? All the stuff like that. It actually, this episode 6 rather ends on a really important note for the rest of the series. It ends with the Russian that he's tried to save sacrificing himself. He's dying anyway, by and large, but he's spent quite a few minutes telling Matt that the only way you're going to beat Fisk is to kill him. You will never get him convicted. You will never get him held for long enough to get him convicted. The only way this ends is if he dies. and that sets up the next arc, the next major arc for the following 3 episodes. It's just where Matt trying to come to grips with this. This actually leads into them reintroducing the priest from episode 1. The moral challenge of am I prepared to kill this man is a big part of the rest of the season actually, and Matt dealing with the conflict there and the kind of prototypical Catholic guilt. No offense to the Catholics out there. But just, this is kind of the gauntlet being thrown down by someone who is willing to kill, that if you want to stop this, you have to kill him. And we get quite a few episodes of him trying to come to grips with that. And it foreshadows and sets up a lot of important stuff to come. But no, Ben as the moral center, as kind of the anchor to reality, to what you can do, what you can say, is absolutely fantastic. The actor does a phenomenal job. He's very well written. And again, he's a fully fleshed out character with his own motivations and issues, and you agree with him more often than not, but every now and then things happen in his life that might run counter to what we're seeing our 3 main protagonists try to do, but we understand where he's coming from every single time, and a really fantastic portrayal. Very well written character as well.
Yeah, I've enjoyed him tremendously so far on the show, and look forward to seeing what the second half of the season brings for him. That sort of is a nice place to wrap up our recap of the second quarter of the season. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to the Radulich and Broadcasting Network 4-part review of the Netflix/Marvel series Daredevil. I am your host, Gavin Napier. Joining me on the podcast, on the review tonight, is the namesake of the Radulich and Broadcasting Network, Mr. Mark Radulich himself. Mark, how are you this evening?
I'm doing just dandy. I turned off Iron Man 2 for this, and I'm excited to talk about Stick and Kick 'em Again and all of that good stuff. I love these 3 episodes. I'm chomping at the bit.
Also joining us tonight, emerging from the wilderness of the far west, we have the one and only intellectual and eloquent Sean Comer. Sean, welcome back to the Radulich and Broadcasting Network.
Howdy, guys.
Sean, real quickly, since this is the first time that you have joined us for the reviews of this series, you said you love this show. What is it about this show that makes you love it so much?
Well, for one thing, it absolutely manages to, within the space of the first 2 episodes, shame even the few redeeming aspects of the 2003 Fox movie. Just absolutely blows it utterly out of the water. It's proof that unlike DC, which is very one note, very monochrome in how they seem to treat every single last one of their characters, it shows that not only does Marvel have a lot of tools in their belt in terms of how they can frame each individual character's world, but it also shows that Disney, for all its family friendliness as an overall corporation and a brand, had no intention whatsoever of handcuffing Marvel. That they were just going to just let them fly and color this world the way they felt that it needed to be. Because, you can't do Daredevil in the same vein you would do Captain America, just like you couldn't do Iron Man in the same vein you would do Thor. You have to really get down to the soul of each property and of each character. And with this, they went right to the very finest hours of the series, and that was Frank Miller's work on The Man Without Fear. Generally speaking, it's more versatility. It's more truth to everything that I really wanted to see out of the character and everything that I felt like every single one of these characters should be. Episode
7 of Daredevil is probably my favorite episode of the series so far. Of all of the 9 episodes that we will have recapped through tonight, episode 7 is probably my personal favorite. And the reason that it's my personal favorite, Sean, is because of the wonderful performance from one Scott Glenn. Scott Glenn is a character actor that will probably never be called upon to carry the day as the heroic lead in a motion picture that is a blockbuster or a long-running television show. However, in situations like Episode 7 of Daredevil, where we see him appear as Matt Murdock's mentor, Stick, he excels. He becomes a force of personality that just takes over the screen, and he is the perfect asshole to Matt Murdock's striving hero. We see some background between Matt Murdock and Stick. We see him involved with Matt at a very early age in the orphanage and helping Matt channel the heightened senses that are starting to overwhelm him a bit. What were your general thoughts on this episode and Scott Glenn's performance?
I think that it's so much better than really trying to do just a straight up from the very, very way back exposition dump origin story, because I like flashbacks. I like how much like the way they were used in Lost, the way they put you inside the head of the character they're supposed to be focused on. You could really tell from the first tone of their interaction that it was going to end up roughly how it did, right down to Matt finding the crushed bracelet that he thought Stick had thrown away. Even that part was just a little bit on the obvious side. Overall, I like how it reflects on everything that Matt is currently right now both determined not to be, but also that he's really struggling not to be. It's almost like if you took Matt Murdock from this series and somehow via some wacky, horrible abomination of an Elseworlds tale paired him with Stephen Amell's Oliver Queen from the first season of Arrow. It's like you paired those two and you got to have them really bounce pretty well off of each other. And it did include one surprise, the surprise that ultimately they did reveal at one point that, oh yeah, as a matter of fact, yes, Stick did in fact kill a kid, which, yeah, I admit, I didn't see coming. I didn't think they would actually go that far.
Mark, Sean mentioned a bit of predictability and how the ending was fairly obvious. Do you find some comfort in being able to know where things are going? Because I agree with Sean that it was obvious in where we were heading with the episode, right down to the moment with the bracelet that he finds that he thought had long since been destroyed or carelessly tossed away. I didn't so much mind knowing where we were going because it made me want to see what the journey to get there was. Do you mind some predictability in a series like this?
No, I mean, I don't. You guys are much quicker at seeing some of the twists and turns coming than I do. I'm not to say that I'm completely floored, but I'm just not actively thinking about what the next thing is going to be or where they're going with this. I sort of watch rather passively, and that might be because I'm choosing to watch this late at night, in bed or whatever. But I will tell you this: no matter, even if I know what the spoilers are, even if I know something's coming or I can predict something is coming, a performance is a performance. A piece of media, entertainment. If it's quality, I'll enjoy it. I don't need to be surprised. I need to be entertained. So I'm good. I was good with it. Even if there were certain times where, like Family Guy or something like that, I can kind of see some of that stuff coming. And I'll even say it to Melissa. I'll be like, oh, go watch. This is what's going to happen. Oh, there it is. But I still laugh. Criticize me all you will, but I still laugh at Family Guy even when I see the joke coming or I see the twist in the plot.
Well, the other elements of this episode that we're introduced to are the Black Sky and what will presumably become the Ninja Clan of the Hand. We see a lot of mysticism, some Middle Eastern mysticism being introduced to mythology and the lore of the Daredevil character.
The most clever fan service you'll see throughout this is the stuff that really only fairly serious Daredevil fans are going to spot right off the bat, and that, to be perfectly honest, with the exception of one or two moments, I needed a YouTube video to point out to me. I didn't get the little possible kind of maybe sort of wink at Bullseye, but I did pick up on the definite reference to Matt and Elektra already being acquainted by this point from one of the flashbacks. It kept everything very focused. In this series, they've hinted at a couple things that are to come, but for the most part, they've done it largely in passing. There are no frequent appearances by the hand because it allows them to just focus strictly on Matt and Fisk. Matt and Fisk. That's what it's coming down to for this 13th episode.
Episode 8 of Daredevil, which I believe, Mark, you have referenced as your favorite episode.
This one and 10, Nelson versus Murdoch, they're tied for the two best episodes of the season.
Now, for me, the words "kick him again" have become just the best thing ever. I never thought I could love a sentence as much as I love those three words. Or keep kicking him, kick him again. You know, it's just beautiful to watch a child be corrupted. But before we really dive into the meat of this episode, is this episode Vincent D'Onofrio's heavy push for an Emmy in this series? Because we've seen that the Emmy board or the nominees are willing to include people from Netflix series.
Okay,
and
let me in here. If Vincent D'Onofrio doesn't get an Emmy at least a nomination, not insisting that he win, but if he doesn't get an Emmy nomination for that episode, if not the entire series, then the world is corrupt and there is no God.
If I understand how the Emmys work, and please, if either of you know differently, correct me, but my understanding is that each nomination for an Emmy is for an individual episode of a television series. For example, if The Simpsons are nominated for Best Animated, then they're not actually winning for their entire season. They're winning for a particular episode that they have submitted to the Emmy board. Is that correct?
I believe you are correct.
In that case, then I'm with Mark. If there's not a nomination forthcoming for this episode, then it's hard to take things seriously. Mark, since this is your favorite episode of the series to date, why don't you expound on it a little bit for the listeners and talk about why you love it so much?
Well, obviously the performances are wonderful. I like the fact that Daredevil is television jiu-jitsu at its finest. There's no wasted motion. They spent an entire episode of this man buying a painting, and there's a payoff for the painting. There was nothing wasted there. And I loved it. I love the fact that he bought the painting because it reminded him of the wall that his father used to make him look at as punishment when he was in timeout. I absolutely love that time. I love the fact that they set him up in the beginning instead of having this routine, and by the end of it, it's upended with Vanessa, who tells him, who basically gives him the Adrian speech in Rocky III. Get out there and win. Don't worry about what you're going to lose. Just fight, for God's sakes. I loved, so there's a lot of juxtaposition and things paying off, and that's the richness of storytelling that draws me in and makes me want to do these kinds of podcasts and talk about it with like-minded folk. It's watching something like that, it gets me excited about television and movies. Specifically, who hasn't had an experience with a bully, or known somebody who had an experience with a bully? By the same token, who hasn't had an experience either themselves personally or through someone that they knew with an abusive parent? We've all, if you didn't experience it yourself, I'm sure you knew somebody. And those issues hit home with me. there were elements and themes in this episode that reached out and grabbed me and drew me in, on top of the richness of storytelling and the performances and the direction. One of the things that I keyed into about this episode especially, but this series, is how vulnerable they made Wilson Fisk. Because I don't remember him being much of a character in the Marvel Universe other than he was a menacing figure. He can kick the shit out of, like, Spider-Man somehow, in Daredevil in a fist fight. And he was a corrupted bad guy. And by no means am I tearing down the Kingpin. I just don't remember him showing a whole lot of vulnerability. I don't remember him being from what I've read, and mind you, I've read comic books years and years ago, but what I knew of the Kingpin, he wasn't all that interesting of a character. They took whatever that was, and maybe there was something there, and gave this guy so many dimensions. And he's, and it's weird because you find yourself rooting for him to a point, and then you have to be reminded, wait, he's a corrupted, terrible human being who's, who is trying to remake Hell's Kitchen with heroin funds. So, and he's killing people left and right. But for a moment, for 60 minutes of that show, he's this kid whose father is psychologically torturing to the point where he hits him with a hammer. He has to cross that line. And I have to say, overall, this was as much the Daredevil season as it was the Wilson Fisk season. I mean, he wasn't just a bad guy. He kind of reminds me of Jack Nicholson's Joker from Tim Burton's Batman. You could have renamed the damn thing Kingpin, and it would have been just as good a show. He's that good of a character, and that episode exemplified that.
Well, for the record, Kingpin in the comic books is not just an average schmuck that works his way up the ladder of the New York City mafia scene. Kingpin, as we are introduced to him in the Marvel Universe, has solidified his place as a villain already, which was the nature of the comics when these characters were introduced. There was no time to develop Kingpin and show you where he came from the ground up. You had the first issue of Daredevil, you needed a bad guy for him, and you got the Kingpin. What we get is the opportunity for the first time to really give you a backstory on Wilson Fisk that's available to the mass media. It's been touched upon in the comics, it's been delved into from time to time, but this is the first at-length, in-depth retelling of where the Kingpin came from. He also, in the comics, has a somewhat heightened strength, somewhat above human capacity for strength and ability to endure punishment. He's certainly not a demigod-level superhero that belongs in the Avengers, but he's also not just a big fat guy. He has some abilities as well.
You ask if this is a great bid for Vincent D'Onofrio to get an Emmy nomination? Oh, hell yes. You could actually take out Matt, Foggy, Karen, Ben, just remove them from it altogether and just reduce it to being more or less a short film about Wilson Fisk, and you would still have something that would have me absolutely glued to the screen, and I really, no disrespect intended to any of the other performers, but I wouldn't miss any of them. You could just make the whole thing Vanessa and Fisk and the flashbacks, and you've got a highlight of the entire series. All that being said, I think that as a character, if you're going to compare Fisk to anybody, he's a lesser Lex Luthor. But on the other hand, in terms of his general purpose, he's that guy who, yeah, he's a physical, hand-to-hand, mostly match for a lot of people, but his real strength is in the fact that tactically, mentally, as a strategist, but that's a good description of him. And also he has going for him that he's determined to save Hell's Kitchen seemingly from itself by any means necessary, even if he has to do it by force and crossing lines that the vigilantes and the police and the politicians won't cross or can't cross. He's willing to do it because he feels he's doing it for the right reasons. When you boil all that down, you really have not the Kingpin, but you have a Wilson Fisk that I don't think, even if he had lived, you could have gotten Michael Clark Duncan to play, because he just wouldn't be as effective. He wouldn't bring out that same vulnerability and awkwardness, and you wouldn't get to enjoy that progression right up to his press conference when he emerges from his shell. And that's when we really start to see the very first inklings of him truly becoming the Kingpin, when he's able to hold himself up there that proudly.
Well, Mark, I know you're a big fan of a show called The Wire, and in the flashbacks to Wilson Fisk's childhood, we see a familiar face from The Wire. Dominic Lombardozzi shows up and plays the verbally abusive, controlling, prototypical hard-ass 70s guy. And he's pretty much ruining his wife and child's life along with his own by getting in bed with the mob, taking out loans that he'll never be able to pay back. And he's a disgusting human being. But in spite of all of this, in spite of all of this guy's character flaws, in spite of all of the negative traits about him, you still want to see him kick that kid's ass that's been running him down. Because he walks up to the kid's just got this smug look on his face, and he's like, yeah, so what are you going to do? And for all of the uselessness of Wilson Fisk's father as a person, you still want to see him lay into this punk kid. And in doing so...
I have been known to turn to my coworker and ask, how much prison time am I going to get for punching a 5-year-old? So, yeah, I saw where he was coming from. I sympathize.
But in doing so, he unlocks something inside of young Wilson, in forcing Wilson to embrace this rage and act upon it. He's unknowingly setting the dominoes in place that will fall towards his own demise when young Wilson Fisk caves in the back of his head with a hammer and then continues beating him until he's a twitching, bloody mess on the floor that his mother has to hack in bits with a saw. This was the Marvel Universe, as it's been presented to us in cinematic form, is a very sanitized place. It's bright lights, it's flashy surfaces, it's shiny things, it's well choreographed action sequences, and even the really gritty parts, like Captain America and Bucky storming into World War II, are very, very sanitized. This is not sanitized in any way. This is the Marvel Cinematic Universe getting very dark and very dirty very quickly. What further depths of depravity do you think we can hit in this series? How shocked were you that they went this far in an episode of a Marvel-sponsored series?
I wasn't. I in all honesty, and that's what led to my initial statements of there are some characters in the Marvel pantheon that just don't lend themselves to big summer blockbusters where that's unacceptable, unless you're watching DC films. But, you know, look, there are just so many grim characters, you know, with gritty stuff going on in the Marvel Universe that is acceptable on television. I mean, if you look at the HBO series, you know, Oz, The Wire, to an extremely lesser extent, Treme, from what people tell me, True Detective, and then, you know, draw back from that a little bit, AMC with Breaking Bad, and, you know, all these FX shows, The Shield, Justified, Sons of Anarchy. It's expected at this point. Television is the medium for which you can dig into the muck and mire and pull out some pretty grotesque stuff. I mean, for God's sakes, there's a network television show, it's a cable television show called American Horror Story, which looks gross, by the way. and then another one called The Strain. So it's widely accepted and almost expected, I think, for the television medium to give you something, short of a strong R, in its content. So I think your question sort of implies that there are people at Marvel, who are like, oh, we got to keep everything kid-friendly. And I don't think that that's true. I mean, maybe I'm reading you wrong, but I feel like there's people at Marvel who are chomping at the bit to get more stuff like this out there, who realize that, unlike George Lucas did, apparently, that their fans are not just kids. It's not just kids out there reading comic books. You have the entire realm of adults. And an older fan, my father still reads comic books, and he's in his 60s, almost 70 years old. He goes to see these movies. He'll watch Daredevil on Netflix. He watches fucking everything on Netflix. He's watching Law and Order. So when you've got 5 to 70 to work with, if you're not taking some of your content and sort of gearing it and using TV for its maximum potential to give the elder folks watching your product something they can really bite their teeth into, you're wasting your resources. So I am not surprised at all, and I'm eager to see what other tricks they pull out of their hats.
Well, for me, this episode was as much about planting seeds for the future as it was about Wilson Fisk or anything else, because we see Leland Owsley getting a protective suit made by the man who will eventually become the Gladiator in Marvel mythology, and a man who is the outfitter to the supervillains. We see Madame Gal be shamed. We see Nobu intimidated. We see layers coming into the crime structure of Hell's Kitchen. We see Wilson Fisk take steps towards becoming the Kingpin as he starts to vary his wardrobe. He starts to find a little bit of confidence. He switches up the cufflink. So for me, this is a huge episode, not just because of what we see from Wilson Fisk and his character development, but from what we see that can potentially set the table for a lot of stuff coming down the line. Our final episode for tonight, episode 9. Many people have, when reviewing the series, looking at critics, looking at various reviews, refer to this as the best episode of the series. And while I enjoyed it, I don't know that I would go quite that far. I will say that to me, episode 9 felt very much like a mid-season break episode of Breaking Bad, in that you knew from the word go with the episode what you were getting and what you were heading towards. They're setting the table for you for this knockdown, drag-out fight between Matt Murdock and this red ninja who looks frighteningly like the hand ninjas from the comic book, who is eventually revealed to be Nobu. We see this very bloody fight, and while the episode sets you up to be prepared for this fight between Matt and Nobu to be the theme and the climax of the episode, we get to the fight between Matt and Nobu's ending and realize that's not the climax at all. And if this were on network television, if this were on AMC, when episode 9 was over, you would have to wait 6 months or a year and a half or however long it took them to produce another 2 episodes of Mad Men to see the next episode and to see the next development. Sean, the pacing of this episode I did think was excellent, and to me it was probably the best paced episode of the series that I've seen so far. I've only watched up to episode 10, so I have the final 3 episodes to watch. However, I do think that this is the best paced episode that I've seen so far. I don't think it had the best fight choreography. I still think that episode 2 takes that by a mile. But overall, I thought this episode did a very good job of creating some tension, delivering on it, and then pulling through with a nice surprise or 2 at the end. On a scale of 1 to 10, what do you give episode 9?
I would give it about a... I'm not sure I'd really rate anything in this series, anything below a 7, but I would rate this about an 8. You're right. The fight choreography doesn't measure up to that of episode 2. Then again, what I would ask what the hell in this episode does. That is the high watermark for choreography in terms of not just this episode, but any action television series that I've seen in a long time. So that's really no knock on Speak of the Devil. What I will say is this: it embodies something that I love about the action of this episode and about the way Matt Murdock is portrayed. Matt gets his ass kicked. He is human. That is one of the biggest and most important differences between this and the 20th Century Fox movie attempt. And that's the fact that in that, it's strongly implied that Matt gets his augmented senses as a great result of the chemicals that were spilled on him. That they really gave him true superhuman powers. In this, and throughout the entire series, after every fight scene, for as often as Matt is able to completely outclass half a dozen thugs all around him, after every fight, he ultimately ends up taking a few good shots. And it's not like he's some otherworldly hero that soars off into the night without a scratch, just saying, "I must go, my people need me." He limps away gasping for breath. And in this goes a step further because he gets utterly destroyed. He just barely dispenses with Nobu. And then he goes to take on Fisk himself, and Fisk absolutely smashes him. Just like it's hardly a chore, like it's a walk in the park. And Matt basically barely escapes with his life. That's something that you occasionally need to see in a superhero movie for it to stay interesting. It's not interesting if there's never any sense of jeopardy, if you can't carry that off. And this does that so very well. And gets across something from the comics, too, and that's that, again, Matt doesn't win every fight. I mean, there are some times when the struggle keeps him kind of barely at about a 500 batting average. And this just makes it all the more important at the end of the series when the two meet again and the fight is so different. And it's also a great episode for just establishing what a force Wilson Fisk really is and how much this newfound confidence is really starting to change him and bring him out of his shell. And again, it's another small step toward us seeing not just Wilson Fisk, but seeing the Kingpin. But all that also comes at an even greater cost, and that is the fact that at the end of the episode, they keep to what is one of the most important traditions about Daredevil, and that is the fact that he has got, next to Spider-Man, the worst-kept fucking secret identity in the entire Marvel universe. Yeah, because... No, he does. Those two are neck and neck, both in terms of having the shittiest love life and the worst-kept secret identities. You could not carry off like an Arkham City-style story of, I know who Matt Murdock is, or I know who Daredevil really is. Okay. And I could go down to the one-legged meth head dancing for nickels in the corner. I'm pretty sure he probably knows who Daredevil really is. Probably knows who Spider-Man is too. Spider-Man probably splits him a $5 every other Tuesday. But the good news about it is it builds up well to the next episode when we have to witness Matt fighting the uphill and for a little while losing battle of trying to reconcile this secret life with how long he's kept this secret from his best friend. And we kind of start to see a little foreshadowing of what this life he's committed to could ultimately end up costing him. So
I want to add something to what Sean said, just a minor thing. What I like about this, and Gavin, you and I have talked before about fighting styles, and when I've had you on the long road to ruin, and I've said to you and Sean, I really don't like an entire movie where everybody is kung fu fighting. It gets boring after a while. I like to see some differentiation in the fight choreography. Sometimes I just want to see Roadhouse. I want to see sloppy, drunken boxing. And to that end, one of the things I picked up about this was that there are multiple fighting styles throughout this season, and Wilson Fisk has his very own. Like, when he gets physical with somebody, there are very specific things that he does. One of the things that jumped, and only because of my my background with hardcore punk, this jumped out at me, but it was an example of something that was very specific to him. There's a point where he's beating on Daredevil at the end of this scene, at the end of this episode, where it looks like he's doing the gorilla. And I expected Stick of It All to jump out behind him and start performing Step Down. If you've seen the video, that's a funny reference. If you haven't, probably have no idea what I'm talking about. In any case, he's not kung fu fighting. He's not jumping seriously into martial arts. He's just brutalizing the people that he physically confronts. And he's throwing these long overhand punches and just being this huge physical force that makes sense for a guy his size. I can tell you, being a larger than average almost 39-year-old man, in physical confrontations, both sparring or otherwise, I've always used my weight to my advantage. And that's one of the things that he does. He just leaning into these ham hock punches, and using his physical mass to overpower people. As a contrast to Daredevil, who is lithe and obviously is trained in martial arts, so it makes for a more interesting fight dynamic when you have two guys going at it with two different styles. Cinematically, it makes it more interesting. When it's the fucking Matrix and everyone's doing the same thing, after a while it gets a bit redundant, in my opinion. So hats off to the fight choreographers and the directors for giving me something pretty to watch.
Well, if this episode were to be narrated by someone, it would be narrated by the one and only late and great shyster, huckster, salesman extraordinaire himself, Billy Mays. Because once we get through the fight with Nobu, we have our "but wait, there's more" moment, where, as you have both alluded to, Wilson Fisk beats the hell out of Matt Murdock. Matt Murdock is full of rage after Miss Cardenas has died. He is full of rage at the fact that Fisk is now untouchable. He is wrestling with the idea of, do I want to kill him or do I have to kill him, and what's my responsibility? Matt Murdock is a very angry man, and he just wants to take out that rage on Wilson Fisk. He catches a beating as a result. But as I mentioned earlier, in true Breaking Bad fashion, Billy Mays can pop right back into the screen and say, but wait, there's more, because in what is the season 1 equivalent of Hank sitting on the toilet and reading an inscription in a book and the light bulb goes off over his head, we see Foggy uncover Matt's face and the screen goes black. Just a tremendous job on the part of the directors to throw a few extra surprises in at the end of an episode at a point in the season where it wasn't really completely necessary. How much of the last 5 minutes of this episode caught you off guard, Mark?
Well, first of all, I did not expect Daredevil to catch such a beating and then throw himself willy-nilly out a fucking window. In terms of something to look at that jarred me, that jumping out the window to save himself from being murdered by the Kingpin is one of those moments that is now burned into my brain. But like I said, I wasn't. There are a couple of things that have happened throughout this season. We'll talk about it. Certain character deaths, one in particular, certain reveals. To go back to what Sean said, the fact that at this point, who doesn't know who Daredevil is? How that hasn't made the Bugle front page, I'll never know. I would have to say I was shocked that that's the direct. And again, knowing not a whole lot about the comic, Daredevil was not a comic that I read. I was shocked that they so soon revealed his identity to Foggy, and I was curious as to what purpose it would serve, what the payoff would be. And not to get too far ahead of ourselves, the payoff is still a mystery. I mean, granted, there's a whole next episode, which you could call a payoff, but I would reserve judgment that there has to be more to why they revealed his identity to Foggy than just what they do in the next episode, which is, like I said, an outstanding episode, some of the best piece of business in the entire series, but I would hate to think that that's all they wanted it for. So, to be continued.
Well, Sean, that brings us to you with the responsibility of putting a bow on these 3 episodes as we wrap up tonight's show.
So far, the show has been absolutely superb, and the first 9 episodes have set it up as being everything that even casual fans of the best years of the comic could have possibly wanted it to be. It's gritty. It's grounded. Matt is very human, very fallible, and right now he's very defeatable. We so far are just now beginning to see the very first just glimpses of the Kingpin. And yet, he's still Wilson Fisk. He's still a human being. Marvel is able to take each of their heroes and able to paint them as people, human beings, fallible creatures with actual flaws. If you want to engage people, you have to give us something to identify with. And thus far, every character in this show, even and especially our villain, is giving us something to relate to. And as we move on into the last part of the series, we're going to see what the very most extreme circumstances can do to people. And I almost guarantee you, you're gonna find a few moments where you're shocked at what some people do, but at the same time, you're going to be asking yourself, could it have been me? Would I have really done anything that differently?
First 9 episodes of Daredevil in the books, 4 more to go.
Look, Daredevil in and of itself has just been an unexpected pleasure. I really, when they announced what they were doing, the 4 characters they were doing, and then the Defenders miniseries, I went, oh boy, Daredevil, who I didn't read, Power Man and Iron Fist, who they separated into 2 different shows for some strange reason, and some broad I've never heard of. I guess I'll watch. And I literally probably would not have watched Daredevil had, the pantheon of nerds that I friend in social media had not been raving about it. I struggled to get through the first couple of episodes, honestly, and but once we got to 4, 5, and 6, and then 7, 8, and 9, boy, did this thing hit the gas. And once we got to 9, at that point I couldn't stop. I was running red lights and stop signs to get to the end of this series, and that's, I think, the way it should be. I think, The Wire kind of did the same thing. It was always a sort of a slow start. And then by the end of it, Sunday couldn't come fast enough for me when that show was live. And so thank God that Netflix allows you to speed up the week and go right to the next show, because the shows were ending in such a way that it would have been unbearable to have to wait another week for them. This definitely felt like the last couple of episodes of Breaking Bad, where you're so entrenched in what's happening and you care so much about these characters that it aches to wait another week to see what's going to happen to them. And so I've enjoyed Daredevil up to this point, and the best is still yet to come. I mean, the way that the last 4 episodes, how they wrap up the story and what happens to these characters, is some really good stuff. There's some surprises, there's some great performances, and questions that need answers. I want to talk about it now, but I know that's not what we're here to do tonight. But there are some things that happened in the finale where I'm just like, oh, what? I don't understand this. So I can't, and that's the way TV should be. At the end of The Shield, I've famously told the story before, but for those of you who haven't heard my stories a million times, when Vic Mackey packs up his gun and walks out of the office to sirens, I had to go running into the next room to wake up my then girlfriend and be like, I got to tell you what happened. I got to share this with somebody. And that's how good TV should make you feel. It should make you just ring with and writhe with passion and emotion, and you want to share that with somebody else, and then go start a podcast so that you can do so and not wake up your sleeping girlfriend or wife.
I'm going to make Mark sad now and say that no television show has ever made me feel that way.
You are an emotionless robot, sir, and a cranky old man to boot.
Probably. That pretty much does it for our actual recap of episodes 7, 8, and 9 of the Marvel Netflix series Daredevil. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Radulich and Broadcasting Network. I'm Gavin Napier. I will be joined tonight by Robert Winfree, and this is the final installment of the 4-part review of the Marvel Netflix series Daredevil. Robert, how are you this evening?
I'm pretty good. I'm happy. I'm still conscious. I have not yet succumbed to the inevitable clutches of death. I'm good.
Well, it sounds like you're doing better than some of the characters we're going to discuss tonight.
Just a few.
I guess we can jump right in since we've got 4 episodes tonight. Episode number 10, Nelson v. Murdoch. And Robert Foggy was none too thrilled with Matt's revelation as the devil of Hell's Kitchen. And I can understand it somewhat, and from another side you think, well, Foggy's looking out for you. You shouldn't be so hard on him. Just from a character point of view and where your reaction would be personally, how would you feel to find out that your best friend and coworker had been hiding such a secret from you?
I imagine I would have reacted very similarly to how Foggy did. I might not have actually said, "Are you really blind?" to start my interrogation, but and at the same time, I understand that being a reaction. Apparently everything you know about this man who you've known, from day one of college pretty much, which that's one of my favorite, this is probably my favorite episode of the whole season. And which is odd considering it's light on the action. It's very much the characters and a bit of the story, but all of the stuff with Matt and Foggy, both in the contemporary sense and the flashbacks to their college time together, it's just a highlight of how great those two play off of each other. And I imagine I would have reacted very similarly to how Foggy did, and because that's a heck of a bombshell to have dropped on you. Not only is your best friend, your coworker, hiding something of that magnitude, he's actually a character who, they set Foggy up over the previous couple of episodes as a very anti-Daredevil person. Daredevil is, the character is portrayed in a negative light. A lot of people believe him to be a terrorist responsible for the bombings that took place in 6, where Wilson Fisk blows up half of Hell's Kitchen. A lot of people have blamed Matt Murdock, the devil of Hell's Kitchen, for that, and Foggy's one of them. And now you've got your best friend, and now you think he's a terrorist. And there's a lot of shock. There's a lot of having to reconcile things, and I think he reacts very much the way that character, or pretty much anyone, would react under that particular set of circumstances. It's an extraordinarily well-written sequence that takes place between the two of them. And I'm curious, for you, the flashbacks to the two of them in college and a bit of their backstory, that played very well for me. I was wondering, from your perspective, how did that work for you?
I think maybe the best thing that I can say about it, and I don't mean this to be a backhanded compliment, I mean this as a very genuine compliment, but to me the highest praise that I can give it is that their interactions came off very natural. They didn't seem to be acting, and it wouldn't surprise me to find out that a great deal of those scenes were ad-libbed with Charlie Cox and Eldon Henson playing off of each other naturally. I think that those two have developed a pretty strong chemistry on screen. I think their interactions are one of the high points of the show that, as we'll get into over the course of the next hour, give or take, I think the show sort of limped towards the finish line given how strongly it started. But I enjoyed the interactions between Matt and Foggy and thought they came off, again, very natural. And that's not always something that's easy to accomplish for characters, especially when you're dealing with characters who, while not necessarily on this show, but in media in general through the comic books, have a great history together, and so you know that people are going to be watching with some level of expectation for seeing that. I thought they did very well, and I thought that this was, to date, Eldon Henson's by far best performance and moment to shine in the series.
I agree with that completely. This is kind of his showcase episode where he goes through, a substantial range of emotion, and it all feels very genuine. It all feels very real. And he is one of the stars of this entire series. I mean, he's a character who, and the way he's written and the way he's portrayed, is very much not. He's comedic relief, but he's not a joke. He's a bit on the lighter side of things, but when he has to deal with the heavy lifting emotionally, he can do it. I mean, he's very much affected by the murder of Elena Cardenas, the woman they've been representing. Here you have Matt basically collapsing his world on him. He does a very good job handling the more serious stuff as well, and that's to his eminent credit as an actor that he's able to do that, because not a lot of people have that kind of range in them, especially over a relatively limited, scale. There are guys who can do comedy, who can do drama, but to go between them as seamlessly as Henson does for his turn as Foggy it's really kind of a rarity. And he does, a phenomenal job with this. I have nothing but good things to say about this particular episode, from top to bottom. Even the stuff with Karen and Ben going to visit Wilson Fisk's mother, it feels fine. It feels organic. And again, there's not a bad moment. There's not a bad sequence in this entire episode as far as I can tell.
Well, you mentioned Karen and Ben going to visit Wilson's mother. I've likened elements of this show, certainly not as a whole, because we're a long way from seeing how that plays out, but elements of this show remind me very much of Breaking Bad in tone and pacing and things of that nature. Now, again, how the big picture unfolds, it's going to be tough to match what Vince Gilligan did with Breaking Bad and all the twists and turns that we took along that route. But for me, this was one of those moments where you see Karen Page and Ben Urich go to visit Wilson Fisk's mother in this nursing home, and even though there's no inherent danger in what they're doing at the moment, there's an incredible sense of foreboding that this was not a good idea on their part, or at least there was for me. How did that scene play out for you?
I see where you're coming from with that. I agree. It was a very subtly foreboding, because they didn't beat you over the head with music. They didn't, talk a whole lot about how dangerous this whole thing could have been. But everyone's reaction when Fisk's mother begins talking about what happened, which we all discovered an episode or two beforehand. I might have been the one immediately prior to it. I forget if it was.
I think it was the episode before Speak of the Devil. I think it was episode 8.
Yeah, 8. Shadows and Glass. And so we already know what she's going to say, and incidentally, Fisk's backstory is equal parts fascinating and horrifying in the appropriate measures. It makes sense, by and large. And the way that the characters react to the news that they get, this is not they're not jumping up and down with the, we've got the evidence, we broke the case, we broke the story, what have you. There's still a lot of solemnity to what's going on. Ben Urich, as veteran crime reporter that he is able to kind of convey the gravity of what they've done and what they've potentially opened themselves up to. And it contrasts nicely with Karen's relative naivete when it comes to the severity of their situation. And that's going to become, that plays very heavily over the next 2 episodes specifically, that, Ben is very hesitant to take what he knows now and move forward with it. And in large part, I think that's because he is aware on some level that when you begin involving people's families, it's not a line you don't cross necessarily, but it's something you don't cross lightly. And here he is, more or less conned into stepping over that particular line in this instance, and he is aware of the potential world of hurt that could come down on them because of it. And Karen is just kind of happy to have information and, a reliable source, more or less, to confirm what they've suspected about Fisk. And the contrast there is very well done. It's very well handled. And I agree with your assessment as far as, it plays somewhat like Breaking Bad in that not everything is immediately dangerous, but there is the overwhelming sense of foreboding kind of throughout that sequence. And it's handled in a very kind of understated manner. It's adequate foreshadowing as opposed to beating you over the head with it, and that's something that's found very infrequently, I've found, in contemporary television. It tends to be very obvious and very heavy-handed.
Yeah, and especially when you're dealing with something like the comic book medium where, as a whole, whether it's on the big screen, on the small screen, or in actual comic books, subtlety is not something that's a strong point for comic books, and probably shouldn't be a strong point for comic books, given that the demographic is primarily 8 to 14-year-old boys. Through some guys like Mark Waid and Jonathan Hickman, Brian Michael Bendis, Frank Miller, Grant Morrison, we see some elements of higher writing ability and some subtlety and some twists and turns. But overall, it's still a medium intended for children and young adults. And so the art of subtlety is not something that's tremendously prevalent in the medium. So for them to work something like that into what is still very much a comic book show, I think is to be commended. And again, I tried to think of a specific instance from Breaking Bad to compare this to, and probably the most logical comparison I can draw it to was when Jesse started hooking up with the girl that he was renting an apartment from. And on one hand, you're like, oh, great, Jesse found somebody that sort of breaks him away from Walt, gives him a little bit of breathing room, gives a little bit of normalcy to his life, and then you find out through their conversation that she also has a past with drugs. And you just think, damn it, because eventually where it's going to lead up. It's not going to go anywhere good. And watching it, you don't know what the end story is going to be. You don't know that Walt's going to stand over and watch her choke to death on her own vomit during an overdose while Jesse's passed out next to her. You don't know the specifics. But you know that when Jesse finds himself involved with another addict, that nothing good is coming, even though the initial feeling is one of relief for the character. In this moment, we're happy that Karen and Ben have found something that they can use against Fisk, but in the back of your mind, there's still that sense that I don't think this is going to end well for one or more parties. For me, this was probably the last really enjoyable episode as a whole in the series. 11, 12, and 13 had enjoyable moments. There were enjoyable elements, but with each episode as we go forward, there's also significant gripes from me, both individually and as a narrative through those last 3 episodes. What were, just real quickly, your final thoughts on episode 10, Nelson v. Murdoch?
Well, real briefly, ironic you should bring up Kristen Ritter, as she's going to feature in the next Marvel Netflix television series. But an apt comparison nonetheless. Now, again, I feel this is kind of the high watermark for the show personally, and I'm not going to debate the merits of, episode 10 versus episode 2 versus episode 8 or 9. I mean, again, there's Shadows in the Glass, which is a phenomenal episode. 2, Cut Man, which is another extraordinary episode. I'm not going to debate. At that point, we're nitpicking, either minutia or just what speaks to us individually, and that's a pointless debate. I agree about kind of going forward. This is a very strong series up until this point, and then it seems like the writers either wrote themselves into a corner or couldn't quite figure out how to undo the Gordian knot they'd tied for themselves, because we get events and moments that are clearly plot devices as opposed to organic storytelling. And again, I'm with you that there are great moments in the episodes to come. There are some very good ones, in fact, but narratively speaking, it starts to suffer from Deus Ex Machina syndrome, where we need to get the plot from point A to point D, and we're hung up between B and C type scenario. And it starts to suffer a bit from that, but again, the high watermark for me, as far as the first season goes, is Nelson v. Murdoch. And I don't want to say it's all downhill, because that's a substantial overstatement, but we go from an episode that, kind of like you said, on the whole is very, very good to great, to episodes that have individually great moments but suffer a bit overall.
Well, moving into episode 11, we see the path of the righteous, and we see Matt make some decisions about what's going forward. And for me, this begins the process of something that troubled me greatly. And I guess maybe I shouldn't hold everything against them until I see how season 2 opens up. But for me, episodes 11, 12, and 13 decided that they were going to substitute writing off characters for drama. Because in episode 11, we see 2 of the secondary players in Matt's world sort of disappear. Now, whether Rosario Dawson is intended to return for season 2, I don't know. I don't know how much involvement she'll have in the other Netflix series. I haven't researched those to see whether she's been listed as true. That she is partially based on the night nurse is someone who is prevalent for the street-level heroes in the Marvel Universe. And so with Iron Fist and with Luke Cage and with Jessica Jones, she certainly has the opportunity to be involved. Whether she is or not, I don't know. But we see her patch Matt up one last time, and they say they're somewhat poignant goodbyes mixed with a little bit of lightheartedness, where she remarks that she at least got to see him with his shirt off one more time. And she tells him, I'll be around if you really need me. Robert, do you know of any additional involvement from Rosario Dawson in this series or in the Marvel Netflix universe going forward?
I'm not aware of anything that's been confirmed. And anyone out there who does know, feel free to, shout at me on Facebook or Twitter or whatnot if you feel so compelled to. I would be surprised if she didn't play some role again. Like you said, she could easily feature in the other street-level heroes. Easily could feature in the Defenders, which is kind of their culmination storyline. I would be very surprised if at the very least she is not back for season 2 of Daredevil. That would honestly surprise me a little bit if she's not in there at all. And that's not just because I feel like Rosario Dawson could use the work. I think the character brings something to the series. I think there's things that can be explored and looked at within it. And I'd just be very surprised if they didn't reintroduce that same character, because there's enough backstory, enough interactions, enough on-screen chemistry established with especially Matt Murdock. I'm not sure one way or the other. I've not heard anything, but I would be surprised if they couldn't come to some kind of agreement to bring her back, because she adds a nice level of complexity and an interesting character to the overall world that they've created for Daredevil, and will be creating for the rest of the street-level heroes.
Well, Matt Murdock in the comics is something of a ladies' man, which we've seen hinted at as we progress through the season, and the emotional bond between he and Karen Page continues to develop.
there have been multiple hints dropped to this Greek girl that he dated in college, which if you're a fan of Daredevil and you don't know what that's alluding to, I suggest you stop listening to this podcast now and go catch up on some basic history of the character. And now we have Claire, who at maybe not necessarily romantically, but at least sexually there's a relationship there. There's a level of attraction. So there's a very complicated web of love interests for Matt. And we see Foggy sort of pulling away from Karen and gravitating back towards Marcy. But the big thing in this episode, obviously, is that Wesley finds out that someone has been in touch with Wilson Fisk's mother. And he takes it upon himself because Wilson Fisk, as we have established in earlier episodes, is his friend. Rather than force Wilson to spend time away from Vanessa while she recovers from the attack at the fundraiser, which saw multiple people falling over from being poisoned and Wilson Fisk rushing Vanessa to the nearest hospital, Wesley decides that he's going to take care of it himself, and he tells Francis, give me your gun, give me the keys, I'm going to go take care of this. If Wilson asks for me, I won't be gone long. And so Francis does. It
was a poor decision all around.
It was not a good decision, and honestly, not a terrible decision on Wesley's part, just poorly handled. The interrogation with Karen Page and how things unfolded with her, to me, seemed, one, very out of character for Wesley, and the ending seemed very unnecessary for me. And I say this because I'm not opposed to characters dying on a television show. In fact, I think the idea of a television show where no one is... Pardon?
We need more of it. In traditional network television, nothing changes. Nobody is ever legitimately at risk. It's one of the things that I found so refreshing about shows like, The Shield or Breaking Bad or, to various extents, The Walking Dead. You right. have all these people who you have become attached to, and yet somewhere in the back of your mind is, anyone on this show could die at any given point. So you are constantly nervous for them, as opposed to, okay, let's see how... let's see how the Flash is going to avert this controversy, this oncoming disaster. I don't mean to poke fun at the Flash, mind you. That's just what came to mind.
Sure.
That's also because that's a CW show, and I find that particular network one of the more egregious offenders of this particular nasty habit of television, that nothing changes. No one is at risk. No one actually dies. There's no peril. Consequently, there's no drama and there's no tension. You're more moderately interested as to how they're going to survive, as opposed to legitimately concerned that, no, this, main character I've spent, seasons getting to know might actually die off. And it's something that I'm with you. We actually need more of it as far as television goes. But I also agree that it made very little sense for this character of Wesley, as he's been presented, to go off completely alone and unaided to handle this situation. He's not that kind of guy. I mean, he would have taken somebody. I mean, even a street-level guy, the black guy who he gets information from on occasion, he would have grabbed somebody to go with him. It just seemed very much like we would like to kill the character of Wesley, in large part to try and devote more screen time to Fisk and Vanessa, and that doesn't work out as well, but it just seemed like there was a mandate to remove this character before the end of the season, and this was the kind of jerry-rigged in their way to get rid of him. Which is really a shame because I've mentioned this before. I think you agree. The chemistry and the interplay between Vincent D'Onofrio as Wilson Fisk and the character of Wesley is some of the best in the entire series. And his death was just it was poorly handled, I feel, by the showrunners more than anything. I mean, I'm with you. I'm okay with him dying. It just didn't make sense.
Well, this is where we start to see the diversion from my comparisons to Breaking Bad, in that, when someone died on Breaking Bad, while it may have been heartbreaking at times, and while
we may not have wanted to see the character go. By and large, anyone that was killed off on Breaking Bad, it made sense. It fell in line with where the character was. It fell in line with what the character's motives were and how they would typically behave. And the situations they found themselves in weren't tremendously shocking. With this, not only do we find Wesley going off vastly unprepared, underestimating someone who is a thorn in their side, and taking no one with him, with not really much of a plan at all, other than he's going to intimidate them and scare them away and make them sing the praises of Wilson Fisk. I can't imagine Wesley being the type of guy to leave a loaded gun within arm's reach of someone he's trying to intimidate while he says, "Oh, hold on a minute, let me answer the phone." Everything about this situation played against what we've seen from Wesley so far through the season. And while, yes, I am disappointed that Wesley will not be a part of future seasons because they've killed his character and there doesn't seem to be anything supernatural about Wesley, I'm also frustrated at the way he died because it just doesn't make sense. And to me, this is really where you start seeing some loose threads on the show that start to take away from the overall experience.
The other thing that kind of bugs me about that whole scenario is the juxtaposition of the very fine acting that goes into it. I mean, Deborah Ann Wall, who plays Karen Page, does a phenomenal job throughout the entire series, but these next couple of episodes, specifically as it just pertains to her performance, I think she carries herself and she handles these situations very well. She very accurately portrays, the after effects of having killed this human being. We still get cryptic hints about her past, which I imagine will play into season 2. Otherwise, they're just throwing a bunch of albatrosses out there for no reason. And you have the very good acting on both parts, and it's just placed in the middle of this scene that is just so logically inconsistent. It's a very sad thing. I mean, I suppose some of the irony here is that you juxtapose the death of Wesley with the death in the next episode, which the one in the next episode, and I don't want to jump ahead of ourselves here too much, makes perfect sense by and large. It just sucks narratively because, losing Wesley, it does. It sucks, but it almost seems like, again, I feel like there might have been a mandate or something that we can only have so many tertiary characters that people care about moving into the end of the season. We need to keep the focus on, Kingpin and Daredevil, and everyone else is just people that might have been detracting from that seem to just kind of disappear. And it's a really sad thing. I mean, again, especially with the next episode. But as far as this one goes, it made very little sense. The other, I do need to mention that a minor gripe I have also concerning this, and it deals with the character of Melvin Potter, who makes the suit he's made the suits for the Kingpin. He winds up making the Daredevil suit as well. I think Mark Radulich brought this up. I'm not really a fan of everyone on the show being able to, hang with Daredevil and get a prolonged fight sequence out of him. It's not, I don't know, it just came off as we need to have a prolonged fight sequence involving Daredevil in this episode somewhere. Let's stick it in here. And that kind of bugged me.
I will offer two explanations for said fight scene. One which is perfectly politically correct, and the other which is anything but politically correct. And our fearless leader, being in absentia tonight, he's just going to have to reprimand me later if he does not care for my choice of words. The first is that I feel like Matt Murdock may have been holding back because he did not want to entirely incapacitate Melvin Potter, because he was there for a reason, to get Melvin Potter to make something for him. And the other is retard strings.
I find both of those to be adequate explanations, actually.
I think the idea of Melvin Potter as a savant when it comes to tinkering with these things, while being something of a general simpleton, I think that's a nice twist, and I'm always impressed by people who can play those parts believably without making them caricatures. So well done to the gentleman playing Melvin Potter.
Yeah, actually, let me see if I can find the guy who plays him. I actually can't, huh? No, I recognize that actor. I can't remember his name for the life of me, but I do know I've seen him in some other stuff. And I'm curious, you're more familiar with the source material here than I am. I'm just out of curiosity. Melvin Potter in the original material is a villain for Daredevil, the Gladiator, if memory serves. I just picked that up from Ben Cologne the last time I was on this show, actually. Do you think they go that route with him maybe in season 2 and turn him against Daredevil, and we get another proper villain for him as opposed to just him dealing with Wilson Fisk again?
I feel like that's a back pocket type of deal. I feel like that's something that they can just have hanging around to use in a pinch if they get to a point where they're not sure what comes next in between seasons. So we may see him in season 2. I think what's more likely to see from him in season 2 are the seeds planted that create that transformation. Again, when it comes to the issue of foreboding and planting seeds for things down the road, to me, Daredevil's repeated promises that he's going to keep this woman safe, and that's how Melvin Potter comes to make Daredevil suit for him, is this promise that he won't let any harm befall this woman that Melvin Potter cares greatly about. To me, it's just like a big flashing neon sign that says, well, eventually Matt's going to break this promise and Melvin Potter is going to go into a fit of rage.
Yeah, that would make perfect sense. And
so
good.
Just to see the seeds planted there and know what Melvin Potter does become in the comic books, they can take their time with it, and I hope they do. I hope they don't rush it. I hope they don't force it. But in the meantime, Melvin Potter certainly plays an interesting character in this series as a guy that's caught between being inherently good and wanting to do the right thing, but also very emotionally volatile and easily manipulated. For me, going into next season, if we see someone fill in for Kingpin as the big bad on the show, I would be very surprised if we don't see some combination of Elektra and Bullseye.
Yeah, that would make the most sense, yeah, again, narratively at least, that those two would kind of be at the forefront. I think that's all I've got for episode 11, Path of the Righteous.
There's not a whole lot else going on here. As we see the death of Wesley, we see Fisk and Vanessa on the road to recovery, and we see Matt continuing to recover and recoup things. That pushes us into episode 12, which was, for me, maybe the most frustrating episode of the series in both good and bad ways. And we've touched upon it already, so we can just go ahead and dive headlong into it. The death of Ben Urich. Emotionally effective. It frustrates you, it makes you angry, it breaks your heart, because I think the portrayal of Ben Urich so far has just been tremendous. I think that the actor portraying him, I mentioned this in the first episode of the review that we did, I think he did a tremendous job. And how they were able to find a middle-aged black man that happens to look so incredibly like a middle-aged white man from the comic books is astounding to me. But I really enjoyed the Ben Urich narrative that got us to this point, and I think it stayed true to the source material that we have for Ben Urich in the comic books. The reason that his death upset me so much from a narrative level is, again, I find it somewhat unnecessary because he's a useful character, but also knowing that what happened on this show has ramifications throughout the greater Marvel Cinematic Universe, whether it's on the big screen, more Netflix series, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., what have you. Because Ben Urich is a guy that has his hand in a lot of different things throughout the Marvel Universe, whether it's Daredevil
whether it's writing blogs that expose things in Civil War. He's right on the front line of covering Civil War, which, surprise, surprise, that's the next Captain America movie. So it pulls him away from that. He has a hand in Spider-Man, which if we ever see any more involvement from Spider-Man in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, that's missing as well. So to me, to take Ben Urich not only out of Daredevil, but out of the greater Marvel Cinematic Universe, it seems like a bad decision. It seems like a wasted character, especially as well as he had been portrayed and effectively as he had been used.
I completely agree with you. It was sad to see the character die because you had become so attached to him. He had served as such a great, kind of anchor to reality throughout this series, and seeing him in various capacities throughout the rest of the Marvel Cinematic Universe would have been very interesting by and large, because he is just an old school beat reporter by and large, and that's a very interesting character that you could have interact with other people in the. Again, you've got Civil War coming up, which, like you said, the crossover comic event Civil War, all of the issues notwithstanding, and there's plenty of them, folks. It's such a big thing that putting it into the context of a Captain America movie, you could still show, and I fully expect them to continue to show, the repercussions of this on a much more grounded level. And having, the reporters who were in on it, talking about different sides, dealing with, the ramifications of what S.H.I.E.L.D. had become by that point. Incidentally, I'll personally be quite disappointed if at some point in Civil War, Captain America doesn't actually contact the law firm of Nelson and Murdoch to challenge the legality of the Registration Act, which is something that is never discussed in the comics and is another failing of that particular narrative. But I'm with you. It's very sad that they removed that possibility. I mean, on the flip side, within the context of this episode and whatnot, it makes perfect sense for Wilson Fisk to find the man who disturbed his mother and choke the life out of him.
And you mentioned Civil War having plenty of issues. That's actually the crossover that broke me as a comic book collector, because to that point I was very much a completionist, and if I got into a crossover, I got every part of the crossover, no matter how minute or loosely tied to it, and Civil War stopped that. Since then, I only go for the core issues, and if I need to catch up on something that doesn't make sense, I turn to the internet. Civil War absolutely broke me. I'm thinking there's nearly 200 crossover issues and tie-ins across the Marvel Universe with that. It was a monstrosity. That they ultimately retconned to mean absolutely nothing, so there's that.
Yay for comic books. At times, just at times. Yeah.
I did think that this did an excellent job of making Fisk into even more of a monster. It certainly reinforced that he is capable of doing terrible things. And this is the first time we really see Fisk get his hands dirty with someone other than Matt Murdock in the form of his vigilante character. Again, very, very much a sense of danger, and this one was much more prescient and much more immediate. That when you saw Ben walk into his apartment, they didn't show you Fisk. They didn't hint that Fisk was there. They, as you mentioned earlier, they don't beat you over the head with the soundtrack and say, "Danger, Will Robinson, here's scary music" to make you think something's up. You just knew that something was going to happen. And for me, as much as I dislike the decision to remove Ben Urich from the Marvel Universe, I thought that this was a very well done episode and a very well done death scene, in the sense that they kept you guessing and they kept giving you hope through something that John Carpenter and Mustafa Akkad did with the original Halloween, and that's their use and lack thereof of negative space. Because as Fisk was choking the life out of Ben Urich, we kept getting this view over Fisk's shoulder
of Ben Urich's window. And for me, personally, watching this, it was almost like watching a horror movie in reverse, where in the horror movie, you have the hero standing by with this ton of negative space around them, and you expect the bad guy to pop out of nowhere and cut their throat, tear their head off, run them through with a piece of rebar, whatever the case may be. Again, something that Carpenter and Akkad did very well in the original Halloween. For me, with this negative space, I kept expecting to see Murdoch crashing through the window, drive Fisk away, and save Urich at the last minute, only it wasn't to be. So at least from a directorial standpoint, I thought they did a very good job with this, even if I didn't like where they were going with it.
Yeah, I agree. It's very well shot. It's very well executed. I mean, the conversation between Urich and Fisk actually made me wish they had gone a slightly different direction, because it was so interesting. 'Cause this was the first interaction between those two characters, and it was so well done. Urich just kind of steadfastly insisting. Yeah, I mean, Fisk asked him point blank, you know, you lost your job. Do you really think rambling on the internet is going to get anyone to pay attention to you at all at this point in time? And Urich's response is just, you know, people seek the truth. That's very much the essence of that character. He seeks to portray it. He seeks to expose it, and let the people know what's actually going on. And Fisk kind of laments the course that modern culture has taken when he says, you know, that may have been true when you and I were young, but it's not anymore. Now everyone's too obsessed with celebrity weddings and cat videos to care about things that actually matter. Because things that actually matter take too much focus, take too much energy, they're too complex, you can't fit them into 140 characters, and they distract from all of the other texting and the 1,000 channels on the satellite dish. And it's just a brilliant juxtaposition and contrast for those two characters, and it makes me wish so badly that we'd had more of, Urich questioning Fisk at a press conference, and, borderline ambushing him outside of a building, just to see those two interact even more. But this is another scene that I absolutely have to praise Vincent D'Onofrio in, because he delivers that monologue and then goes from... He's described this version of Fisk as a bunch of barely controlled rage. And you see that very much so in this sequence, when he goes from just questioning and having a conversation with Ben Urich to telling him, no, you went after my mother, I'm not here to intimidate you, I'm here to kill you. And then proceeds to violently murder the man. It's so well shot and so well executed, it just depresses me that we didn't get, more interactions between those characters. This episode also deals with, again, I have to talk about a bit about Deborah Ann Woll, who very adequately and accurately portrays Karen Page in the aftermath of having murdered Wesley with a handgun at relatively close proximity. She is dealing with, the stress of it, the flashbacks, and handles that all very well as an actress. And, of course, we get the exit of Madame Gao temporarily. I assume she's going to play another large role, especially in a forthcoming Iron Fist series, because the Chinese triads play a substantial role, and to a lesser extent, I believe the Hand as well will play a role going forward, and will likely feature a bit heavily in the Defenders eventually, because if I had to guess, it's going to be the group of heroes that we've already established coming together to stop whatever bit of mysticism they're trying to execute in Hell's Kitchen. And, I mean, if I had to throw a loose guess, they're trying to open a portal to another dimension and let through all kinds of supernatural horrors, which is not out of line for what the Hand does, by and large.
Well, we got a not-so-subtle reference to her controlling the Iron Fist and the heavy strike that she landed on Matt. And then if you remember in the episode where Matt breaks up the heroin ring, sets things ablaze, the Iron Fist logo is actually on several of the boxes. So definitely some foreshadowing for what's coming on the Netflix series in this episode.
Yeah, that is the sign, isn't it? I'm not terribly familiar with the Iron Fist character, so a lot of the little things are going to slip by me. I don't think I have a whole lot else about the ones we leave behind. Again, that whole final sequence, the decision to kill Ben Urich, the way it's executed, is just kind of indicative of some of the problems we have over these last few episodes, and that you can still see some of the greatness there. Again, a lot of these things are very well executed technically. It just doesn't, again, sometimes it just doesn't make sense, and they're just narrative things that kind of stumble a bit in this particular episode as well. This seems like a very drawn-out episode. We get a lot of stuff that is just kind of there by and large. Again, you get Matt breaking up the heroin ring, which had to happen, but it just seemed like it was one of those things like, we need to give Matt Murdock something to do in this episode. We're going to, okay, we need to get rid of the Chinese, and then Fisk will deal with Owlsley in the next episode, and then Wilson Fisk stands alone as the kingpin of crime. And it just felt like we're getting to the point where they have to check off boxes. And they might be well executed technically, but they're not considered from a narrative standpoint as strongly as some of the other aspects have been up till now.
Well, and not to beat a dead horse, so I won't go back to Vince Gilligan's masterpiece, but in your great dramas and your great television shows, generally the episode right before the season finale, it gives you an impending sense of urgency. It makes you feel like, okay, the next episode's going to be something big. We have to see something big in the next episode because that's how they're going to wrap everything up. And, whether it's The Wire, The Shield, The Sopranos, Deadwood, Carnival, even something as simple and as gravitated more towards the masses than the heavier fare that we've discussed, something like NCIS or CSI. Generally, their penultimate episodes of the season do a very good job of creating that sense of urgency if you're a fan of that show. Now, obviously, if you don't care about NCIS, then so be it. But they do a good job of creating a sense of urgency and drama for the season finale. This, leading into the season finale, I felt like it fell a little bit flat. There was, I wanted to see how everything ended, but I wanted to see how everything ended because I'd already invested 12 hours in the series. There was nothing, especially about this episode, that made me say, okay, I got to know what comes next. I got to watch this right now.
Well, I think that's a byproduct of the Netflix model, and you and I talked a little bit about this the last time I was on here, that when a network orders a television series, there's a big kind of onus on that series to, in each individual episode, leave it almost at a mini cliffhanger, because they have to keep interest episode to episode, because they can be canceled between episodes by and large. And there's a big, sort of Damocles hanging over their heads all the time, and they have to write and produce that way. With a Netflix series, they order 13 episodes, they're going to release all 13 episodes, because they do it all at once. So from a narrative standpoint, you can let things breathe by and large, and as good as that is over the first, 4 or 5 episodes, to not be dealing with cliffhanger after cliffhanger after cliffhanger in a desperate bid to get people to stick around long enough to become invested in the characters and draw decent enough ratings, not to have some group of moronic executives decide, no, we're going to level the axe at this, because the ratings dropped 0.2 of a point. Thank you, Fox, for letting me do that, bring that up over and over and over again. And again, as great as it is for those first 4 or 5 episodes to just let a story breathe and develop naturally, it removes a bit of that on the back end as well, because as a network television series approaches its season finale, they have to generate interest, they have to generate urgency, they have to generate more viewers. And in this case, it's almost the reverse effect of what you get in the beginning. Because in the beginning, you have them desperately trying to, accumulate viewers and keep you around. But by the time you get to a season finale, you have established that. You have a viewer base. You have at least enough people sticking around to see the close of the first season's worth of story. So you can pick and choose where you want to end that penultimate episode, how you want to generate your interest. You get the reverse here, where they have kind of the narrative all laid out, and they're not as considerate about building that momentum because it's still going to be there. They're not going to get cut off at the last second. And instead of that being almost a point of narrative celebration to kind of generate interest and bring out the best in the writing and the production staff, it's just kind of coming to a close, and it falls a bit flat when compared to a great or even an adequate television series that is good at doing that. I would put up the first 5 episodes of Daredevil against the first 5 episodes of any network television show ever. I'll say ever. And I think it holds up over those first 5 episodes, surpassing a great many of them. I mean, again, the truly great television stuff, Breaking Bad, The Wire, The Sopranos, okay, it's not going to work, it's not going to stand head and shoulders above them, like it does stuff like CSI. Much as I love the show Criminal Minds, it certainly stands above the first 5 episodes of that series. Anything else, basically, it stands head and shoulders above because it's of that narrative freedom. Again, the downside is the back end, when there's no drive for ratings, there's no drive to generate interest because you're so secure in it. It's, again, the lack of competition, the lack of that, sword of Damocles, for want of a better expression, shows when you get kind of towards the end, because I'm with you. As deeply effective as the death of Ben Urich was, there was nothing else about the episode pushing the narrative forward. And that's a fault of planning out the show and trying to generate interest from episode to episode. In this particular instance, basically not doing it at all, because like you said, you've invested 11 to 12 hours into this product. You're not going to skip out on the last episode.
Yeah, and that does lead us into the final episode, for better or for worse, where the secondary character death tour or death march continues. We'll touch on that later because it didn't upset me nearly as much as the others. A lot goes on in the final episode. We see Matt and Foggy and Karen celebrate a victory of sorts as they manage to get Detective Hoffman back into custody for the one cop they know that they can trust, and he brings this empire crumbling down. What's that?
That bugged me so much. I mean, from a narrative standpoint, we get to the final episode, and oh crap, we actually have to bring him down. What could we possibly do? Well, there's this character that we didn't exactly deal with, and he's now going to be the linchpin in the Kingpin's crime syndicate. He's going to know something about everyone, and this one character is going to be enough to bring down his empire, and we've just never been privy to this information before. And that's, to me, what they did with Hoffman to try and bring down the entire Kingpin empire just reeked of, again, Ghost in the Machine syndrome. It just reeked of, okay, we need plot point to do this, and this works.
I definitely felt like this was the very comic book moment. Like, is this where they got a little cutesy with things? And you know what? They're allowed to get cutesy and comic booky with stuff this season. If they keep it to once a season, I'll let it slide. I agree that it was a bit hokey and contrived, but if they do it once a season, I'll allow it, and I won't gripe about it.
Everybody gets one.
Much. That's it. But we did see a bit of celebration as Foggy and Matt and Karen get back on the same page, only to find out that Fisk is not quite so easily defeated. And so Matt decides, well, now I have to put on the Simpleton's costume that he crafted for me out of the unbreakable trench coat lining material that Fisk and Owsley wear, and I have to go put a stop to things. Before the big showdown between Matt and Wilson Fisk, though, we see Wilson Fisk put the pieces together on the attempt at what he thought was the attempt at his life at the fundraiser, only to put the pieces together and realize, no, they were going after Vanessa to try to bring him down.
and try to keep him under control. And so, yet another secondary character meets their apparent demise as Leland Owsley is tossed down an elevator shaft in an abandoned building and left for dead. Again, this one doesn't bother me nearly as much. Leland Owsley has always been a secondary villain for Daredevil in the comic books at best. And in the comic books, he's not nearly as old as Bob Gunton trays him on this show. So I was never under the impression that this version of Leland Owsley was going to be the Owl and the bane of Matt Murdock's existence as he is in the comic books from time to time. We also see an allusion to Leland's son, which I would imagine is how things will progress from here if we do see the Owl as a villain.
They mention his son a few times throughout the season, and I'm with you. I'd imagine his son is going to be the one who kind of tries to be the bane of Matt's existence.
Do you have any thoughts one way or the other about the apparent death of Leland Owsley?
Nah, it works. They set this up from the very beginning of this season, in that Kingpin is in this. When we first meet him, Wilson Fisk is kind of the figurehead of a syndicate, an organization comprised of the Japanese Yakuza, the Chinese Triads, the Russian, I forget the name of their particular group of organized crime, so forgive me there. And a bit of, with a bit of old-fashioned, 1%er money laundering thrown in the form of Leland Owsley. And throughout the whole season, he slowly picks off all of these people who are in this council, so that at the end of it, he'll be able to stand alone atop the pyramid of dead bodies. And I'm okay with that. That's okay. And look, Owsley biting it here doesn't bother me in the least. I mean, at this point, he was just kind of there to be killed. He didn't offer a whole lot. I mean, he was a fun character to have around. I was perfectly fine with it. I was fine with Fisk shaking off the taser to the neck and then throwing him down the. I was fine with all that. It made sense for what things were at the time. That doesn't bother me almost at all, really, at this point. I mean, and again, they were just killing off secondary characters left and right for these final few episodes, and he was going, and I think we all knew he was going from as soon as Fisk started playing all of the other, kind of council members against each other. We all knew the Russians had to go. They were too volatile. Nobu is becoming a pain. No, look, Daredevil lit him on fire. That works for me. Owsley is just kind of a white-collar prick, and seeing Fisk throw him down an elevator shaft worked just fine for me.
Yeah, the only concern that this leaves for me is that they're going to be somewhat thin on secondary characters heading into the next season. And I know that there's a wealth of characters to draw from in the comic book, whether it's guys like, I can't think of his name, and he was just in the most recent episode of the Daredevil comic book. But there's a villain who controls shadows that is sort of a joke, but Matt has to deal with from time to time. There are various love interests. There's Elektra, there's Bullseye. There's always going to be Kingpin hanging around. I'm just curious to see how they fill the numerous gaps left by the deaths of Leland Owsley and Wesley and Ben Urich and the apparent departure of Claire for the time being. It certainly leaves the show a little bit thin underneath the top layer. So they've got their work cut out for them heading into next season to fill out the roster again, as it were. I thought that Fisk having one last plan to get out of trouble in this situation was very appropriate, and the narrative for Wilson Fisk, and it was portrayed brilliantly by Vincent D'Onofrio. I can't say enough about what a tremendous job he did. For all of the faults and flaws that I have with how the show limped towards the finish line in some respects, I have nothing bad to say about Vincent D'Onofrio and his portrayal of Wilson Fisk as the Kingpin here. It was tremendous in every sense of the word. But
I think the narrative of Wilson Fisk is a man slowly coming unraveled in a desperate bid for power, that he does consolidate the power of the Hell's Kitchen crime syndicate. But as we see him become more and more unhinged and desperate and willing to get his hands dirty and bludgeon people and strangle people and throw himself out in the open, I thought that was handled very well by D'Onofrio, culminating in this episode where we finally get to see the face-to-face showdown between Matt and Fisk that we've been waiting on since Fisk was taunting him over the radio as he lay at the bottom of a building.
Yeah, if I could draw another narrative, another comparison to another, at times, very good television series, watching him ascend to power and then struggle to maintain it is very reminiscent of the Frank Underwood character from House of Cards, who schemes and connives his way through 2 seasons to actually become President of the United States. Apologies for spoilers there. And the entirety of the 3rd season is his desperate bid to hold on to the power that he's obtained and finding that it's really not that easy. Obtaining power is exponentially easier than maintaining it. I mean, it's a theme that's also explored in the Game of Thrones television series. I don't watch it, but I've read the novels so far, so I'm aware of some of the ongoing themes there. And it's something that, again, we see with Fisk. He wants to be, powerful. He wants to rebuild this neighborhood in New York, kind of in his own image. And as he tries to get power, the trail of bodies he leaves behind him just starts weighing him down. And eventually he just unravels. His almost monologue in the back of that FBI transport van was another great performance, not just by D'Onofrio, but great insight into the character as he finally comes to the realization that he is, not the Good Samaritan, but he is the ill intent, as he puts it in that. And I mean, the fight sequence between Murdoch and Fisk at the end is very well done. That entire last 20 minutes, give or take, starting with Fisk's escape from custody, is just an extraordinarily well done 20 minutes of television by and large. For all the gripes I have about other things, especially over these last 3 episodes, I have a hard time finding anything objectively wrong with that final sequence of events. It was all handled and executed very well.
Yeah, I don't have as many gripes about this episode as the others that we've touched on, simply because I thought they did a good job of wrapping things up, of completing the narratives. I will say this, I think the suit looks ridiculous, and I know it's tough to walk that line between satisfying comic book fans and not looking awful, but for whatever reason, the Daredevil costume just didn't click for me. I couldn't even, if you asked me what was wrong with it, I couldn't even put my finger on it and tell you what I think is wrong with it. I just know that from the first moment I saw it on the screen, when I saw Charlie Cox moving around in it, it just doesn't feel right for me. I don't know if it looks too bulky. It's just, for whatever reason, that's not the way I pictured Daredevil in costume appearing.
I can see that point. I will say this. I think from the neck up, it looks fine. The cowl, the helmet, the mask. I think they did a great job with that. I had kind of the same reaction you did, in the sense that this almost feels like it should be the midway point between suits. When we first meet him, he is obviously in no suit at all, and he makes jokes all the time about working on it. It almost feels like this should be his. If you don't mind using the Iron Man reference, this should be like the Mark I armor. This is kind of what it felt like, and it still needs to be refined and perfected. And the problem is that they presented what feels almost like an unfinished or very rough cut of the suit in the final episode, and to be his suit going forward. At least that's kind of how it came off to me.
I guess to me, if you put a gun to my head and say, tell us what you didn't like about the suit, which would be a weird conversation to have. I don't know why anyone would do that. But if that happened, then I guess to me, it seems too bulky and armored for me. in reading the comic book, it
almost looks like a
seemed to
beekeeper's outfit, doesn't it? You know, that kind of
does.
feel.
And it, in watching the fight scene with Matt versus Wilson Fisk, it seems like a lot of the fluidity of motion is gone in the suit. And for me, I always pictured Daredevil's costume as being essentially a full body set of tights, much like Spider-Man. Not something bulky and armored, but something that allows him to move quickly and silently and allows him fluid motion. And then to see the armor and the thick padding and things of that nature, I think that may have thrown me off. And especially when we got this idea that the suit was being designed from this fabric that they used to line Wilson Fisk's suit. You know, Wilson's suits don't look bulky and armored and things of that nature. So I thought, okay, we're going to get this nice sort of bright red, very fluid, very form-fitting costume that reminds me of what we see in the comic books. And maybe it's something as simple as the Batman ideal that they want to keep things at least somewhat reality-based. I get that. But at least for the time being, the costume's not working for me.
Well, and it wouldn't shock me if they'd made some refinements between this one and between season 1 and Daredevil's next appearance. I mean, you brought up the Batman one, and they actually did a great job going from Batman Begins to The Dark Knight of Bruce actually addressing some of the issues with the suit. You know, I need it to be lighter, so separate the armor plating so I can have more flexibility, and I need to be able to turn my head. And we could very easily get a sequence like that between Potter and Murdoch in the next season, or at the start of the Defenders even, with him just, I need a bit more fluidity going into this, at least in the upper body. We just need to fine-tune the kinks a little bit here, which I would be completely in support of. Again, I don't hate the suit. I'm kind of with you in that it feels, like I said, almost unfinished in the sense of it's not yet the finalized, fully realized version of what Matt Murdock is going to wear as Daredevil on a semi-nightly basis. Well, before we put a finishing touch on this, just real quickly, because I do want to touch on what's coming next in the Netflix Marvel universe. Just real quickly, overall thoughts on the series and on the finale. I very much enjoyed it. I can still go back. I could probably still go back and rewatch this season without too many issues. I mean, again, it stumbles a bit at the finish line with especially, episodes 11 and 12. But on the whole, it's a very well-realized world that they live in. Its depiction of, reality in the setting of the greater Marvel Cinematic Universe is very well done. My complaints are few and far between by and large, and I think it's a smashing success for putting some of these lesser-known characters into a Marvel television series, into a Netflix series. If they're all as good as this, again, my complaints are going to be few and far between. I don't have a whole lot of hope for a few of the other properties that are coming, but as far as this one goes, when you consider the amount of damage that was done to the character of Daredevil with the Ben Affleck movie, and there was a substantial amount of damage done to that property, mind you, this is a rousing success on nearly every level, I'd have to imagine. Yeah, I'm excited to see what comes next. I did think at a couple points watching this and watching Avengers Age of Ultron that we may be nearing the tipping point for comic book properties. I'm excited that Jessica Jones is the next Netflix series just because I want to get that one out of the way so we can get to the stuff I really want to see, which is Luke Cage and Iron Fist. And they may surprise me. I'm not gonna count it out. My anticipation for that just happens to be the lowest of the 4 series. I agree with you. I think they did a good job of fitting this street level action into the greater Marvel Cinematic Universe. They touched on it a couple of times in the series through dialogue,
they didn't beat you over the head with, oh yeah, this is where Avengers happened too. So I think overall, I'll give them a B+ for it. I definitely think the last 3 episodes sort of hurt the overall vibe and makes me a little bit concerned, as I mentioned, about the depth of the character roster moving forward. But overall, I don't have a bad thing to say about the series. And we've talked about this before, but if Vincent D'Onofrio doesn't get an Emmy nod for this and his portrayal of Wilson Fisk, then I'm not sure that we'll ever see anything from a comic book movie get a serious Emmy or Oscar nod, because his portrayal of this was as fine of a job of acting as I've seen on any television series ever.
I will pull a Professor Farnsworth and go, I just don't want to live on this planet anymore. I mean, if he doesn't at least get a nomination, if not an outright win, because he just does, I'm with you, he does such a phenomenal job from top to bottom with that character.
I won't hold my breath for a win just because of the stigma attached to it being a comic book series. But if there's not a nomination here, then I just can't. I just can't imagine him not getting a nomination for it. But I guess we'll see when Emmy season rolls around. If you're a fan of these characters and you're not real sure where to go to get a little bit of backstory, or if you're not familiar with them and you want to read up on them, for me, you can always, when it comes to Daredevil, you can always rely on Frank Miller's Man Without Fear story. The Daredevil End of Days story is a lot of fun. It's outside canon and it's set in the future, but it's an excellent story that came out in the last couple of years that I think is worth a read for the future of the Daredevil character. For Robert Winfree, I am Gavin Napier, and on behalf of Mark Radulich, the namesake of the Radulich and Broadcasting Network, be well, be safe, behave.